Section 19 of the Roman Triumvirates by Charles Merivale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 9. Gaius Octavius succeeds to the inheritance of Julius Caesar. When the conspirators looked round, the hall was already empty. The senators had fled with precipitation. Centurions, lictors, and attendants had vanished with them, and the harangue which Brutus proposed to deliver found no hearers. Antonius had slipped through the crowd, exchanged clothes with a slave, and made his way to his own house on the Carinae. Among the citizens there was general consternation, none knowing on whom the next blow might fall, or which party would be the first to resort to riot and massacre. Both had arms within reach. On the one hand, Decimus Brutus had provided for the defense of his friends by placing some gladiators hard by in the Pompeian theatre. On the other, the city was filled with the dictator's veterans, and Lepidus, his master of the horse, commanded a legion outside the walls. The assassins now marched forth brandishing their bloody weapons and wrapping their gowns about their left arms as a defense against a sudden attack. They reached the Forum, preceded by a cap of liberty hoisted on a spear, exclaiming that they had slain a king and a tyrant. The place was filled with an agitated crowd, but these cries met with no response among them. Disconcerted by this indifference, the liberators, as they now called themselves, retired hastily to secure a place of refuge on the Capitoline. Here, with the aid of the gladiators of Decimus, they barred the gates of the enclosure. In the evening some of the nobles came to join them. Among these was Cicero, who, though previously unconnected with the conspiracy, recovered hope from its first success, and advised that the Senate should be convened immediately. But Brutus preferred to make another appeal to the feelings of the populace. On the morrow he descended into the Forum. To him, indeed, personally, the people listened with respect, but against others who next addressed them they broke out into violence, and drove the whole party back to their place of shelter. Meanwhile Antonius had not been idle. He had communicated secretly with Calpurnia, and obtained possession of her husband's private treasure, and also of his will. With the aid of his two brothers, one a praetor, the other a tribune, he opened as consul the national coffers in the temple of Ops, and drew thence a store of coin, with which he made advances to Lepidus, and received promises of support. Marcus Antonius, who was now coming prominently to the front, had been hitherto slightly regarded as minister and companion of Caesar, but from this moment he assumed in many eyes the position of his natural successor. Hitherto known chiefly for his amours and his dissipation, he was now about to display the arts of a consummate politician. Cicero stood alone in dissuading the liberators from negotiating with him. But they believed in his professions of loyalty, and hoped to gain an ascendancy over the pliant temper which had always yielded to the influence of the dictator. It was agreed that as consul he should convene the Senate for the next day, the 17th of March. He appointed for the place of meeting the temple of Tellus near the Forum, which he filled with armed soldiers. The liberators dared not leave the capital, and the discussion of their fatal deed was carried out in their absence. The majority of the fathers would have stigmatized Caesar as a tyrant, and thereby justified his assassination. But when Antonius represented that this would be to annul his acts and appointments, Dolabella and others interested in them resisted the decree with all their might. While the senators still deliberated, Antonius went forth into the Forum. The people hailed him with acclamations, bidding him at the same time beware for his own life. The senators were uneasy at this demonstration, and Cicero pointed out to them the only course that could relieve them with dignity from their embarrassment. He demanded an amnesty, or act of oblivion, which would simply confirm every existing appointment and leave the deed of the conspirators to the judgment of posterity. In private, he had declared himself a warm approver of the tyrannicide, but he now confessed in his public acts that the peace of the city and the interests of the Senate required a compromise. An amnesty was decreed. The next day Cicero harangued and calmed the populace. The liberators were invited to descend from their place of refuge, Lepidus and Antonius sending them their own children as hostages, and the one entertaining Brutus, the other Cassius at supper. Antonius and Cassius were rude men, and some rude repartees passed between them. "Have you still a dagger under your arm?" asked the one. "Yes, truly," replied the other, "to slay you with, if you aspire to the tyranny." Next morning all parties met again in the Curia, and the dictator's assignment of provinces was confirmed. Trebonius succeeded in Asia, Cimber in Bithynia, Decumus in the Cisalpine, while Macedonia was secured to Marcus Brutus, and Syria to Cassius, on the expiration of their office as praetors at home. Notwithstanding the power thus surrendered to the republican leaders, Antonius was still master of the situation. Since Caesar was not a tyrant, and his acts were sustained as legitimate, his testament must be accepted, and his remains honoured with a public funeral. Antonius recited to the people their favourite's last will. He had adopted for his son the youthful Octavius. He had endowed the Roman people with his gardens on the bank of the Tiber, and bequeathed to every citizen 300 sesterces. This liberality warmed the feelings of the excitable multitude in his favour. The funeral pyre had been constructed in the campus, but the eulogy of the deceased was to be pronounced in the forum. A shrine glittering with gold was erected before the rostra, in which the body was laid upon a couch of gold and ivory. At its head was suspended, like a warrior's trophy, the toga in which the hero had been slain, hacked by the assassin's daggers. The actual remains were indeed concealed from public gaze, but they were replaced by a waxen figure, on which his 23 wounds were faithfully represented. Dramatic shows formed as usual a part of the funeral ceremony, and the sensibilities of the people were moved by the scenic effect of the deaths of Agamemnon and Ajax, caused by the treason or cruelty of their nearest and dearest. When they were thus melting with compassion or glowing with resentment, Antonius stepped forward as the chief magistrate of the Republic to recite the praises of the mighty dead. He read the decrees which had been heaped on Caesar, declaring his person inviolate, his authority supreme, himself the chief and father of his country, and then he pointed to the bleeding corpse, which neither laws nor oaths had shielded from outrage. Lastly, with a movement toward the Capitol, he shouted, "I at least am prepared to keep my vow, to avenge the victim I could not save." The people had been gradually worked up to feelings of fanatic devotion. They forbade the body to be carried outside the city. They insisted that it should be burnt within the walls. Chairs, tables, and benches were snatched from the adjacent buildings. A heap of fuel was raised before the pontiff's dwelling in the Forum, and the body hastily placed upon it. The temple of Castor and Pollux stood hard by, on the spot where the 2 majestic warriors in olden time had announced the victory of Regulus. Now also 2 youths of august mien and countenance, girt with swords and javelin in hand, were seen to apply the torch. A divine sanction was thus given to the deed. Every scruple was overruled. The people continued to pile up brushwood, the veterans added their arms, the matrons their ornaments, even the trinkets on the children's frocks were cast into the fire. Caesar was beloved by the Romans. He was not less dear to the foreigners. Gauls, Iberians, Africans, and Orientals crowded around the pile and gave vent to their sense of the common calamity. The success of Antonius was complete. The populace soon lashed themselves into fury, rushed through the streets with blazing brands, and tried to fire the houses of the conspirators. Their rude assaults were for the moment repulsed, but Brutus and his associates dared not show themselves in public, and either escaped from the city or lay concealed within it. It was plain that the cause of the liberators was lost at the centre of the Commonwealth. The populace raged against them, while the chief of their party in the Senate shrank from assisting them or vindicating their deed. Antonius acted with consummate craft in the use he made of the amnesty which the senators had decreed. He proposed that Sextus, the last surviving son of the great Pompeius, should be invited to return to Rome and assume such a place at the head of his father's friends as they should now choose to grant him. He was well aware, perhaps, that Sextus, in command of his maritime forces, had other ends in view, and that the name of Pompeius had lost all influence over the Republican party in the Senate. But the proposal seemed at least conciliatory, and might be taken as a token of political moderation. A still more politic stroke was the resolution which he carried for abolishing forever the office and title of dictator, a magistracy not less odious to the Senate now than it had formerly been to the people. But among the excited multitude of the Forum, an era of turbulence and sedition had set in. The assassination of their favourite, Caesar, was the pretext rather than the actual cause of the tumults with which they continued to agitate the city. Antonius made these disturbances an excuse for surrounding himself with a bodyguard under the sanction of the Senate itself, and this force he soon raised to an army of 6,000 men, with which he effectually kept peace in the streets. A low impostor named Amatius, pretending to be a kinsman of Marius and Caesar, had tried to ingratiate himself with the populace. The consuls opposed him with energy, overthrew him, and put him to death. Their zeal in defence of the Republic was blindly applauded by the Senate. Even Cicero, though he still utterly distrusted Antonius, could exclaim that his colleague Dolabella was the best and bravest of magistrates. The Senate had confirmed Caesar's acts. Antonius contrived that this confirmation should be extended to the public measures which the dictator had contemplated, even though they had not yet been carried into effect. Armed with this sweeping decree, he proceeded to forge authority for every project he had himself in view. Laws, treasures, magistracies, all now lay at his feet. Things which the dictator had not dared himself to do, Antonius carried into execution in his name. He sold preferments and provinces, retrieved his own dilapidated fortunes, and purchased the support of senators, soldiers, and tributary sovereigns. Under pretense of carrying out Caesar's latest intentions, he reversed the appointments which Caesar had actually made, and broke his recent engagement to the liberators in depriving Brutus and Cassius of their promised governments. Syria he assigned to Dolabella in reward for his opportune support. Macedonia, with the legions which Caesar had mustered at Apollonia, he seized for himself. The rule of one man was absolute throughout the empire. "The tyrant is dead," sorrowfully murmured Cicero, but the tyranny still lives. The tyranny still survived in the person of the consul, but the consul, it might be urged, had been popularly appointed. His term of office was fixed and brief. At the end of a year, at furthest, he must descend into the ranks of the private citizens. It still remained to be seen whether autocratic powers thus strictly limited could be indefinitely extended in the person of a man who possessed no claims to the support of nobles or commons, of provincials or allies. Never yet had any pretender to sovereignty at Rome essayed the crime with so little personal influence in his favour. But if Antonius should succeed to the province of Macedonia, and to the command of the legions of the great Caesar, he would have the material instrument of power in his hand, and all political calculations must depend upon the disposition of this omnipotent soldiery. Antonius was a bold and sanguine man, resolute in act and confident in his powers. But in forecasting the issue of his daring intrigue, he proved, after all, mistaken. Gaius Octavius had spent some months among the legions at Apollonia, and the address with which he had attached them to himself gave token of the genius he was about to display on a wider theatre. Surprised amidst his juvenile exercises by the news of his uncle's assassination, he was not yet aware of the perilous inheritance which had been settled upon him. But his mother's letters from Rome, reminding him of the dictator's favour and of his nearness to him in blood, inflamed his hopes, and determined him to return at once to the city and brave every danger. His friends would have dissuaded him, but the soldiers nearest at hand, moved by the name of their hero Caesar, pledged themselves to support him. Without a moment's hesitation, the audacious stripling threw himself almost alone on the coast of Apulia. Here he received a copy of Caesar's will, as well as of the Senate's recent decrees. Thereupon he assumed his legitimate designation of Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, and presented himself to the garrison of Brundisium as the adopted son of the great imperator. By these soldiers he was saluted with enthusiasm. The friends and freedmen of the dictator flocked around him. The veterans of the colonies drew their swords and offered to avenge his parents' assassination. But the young adventurer was cautious as well as bold. He declined the use or the display of force, while he was yet uncertain of the course to be pursued. With rare self-command, he contented himself with addressing the Senate in mild and temperate language, claiming as a private citizen the inheritance of a deceased father. Arriving at Cumae, he learnt that Cicero was sojourning in the neighbourhood. He went to visit the desponding patriot, and assured him of the loyal moderation of his own views. The veteran but too facile statesman was at once captivated, and persuaded himself that the son and heir of the great usurper was a faithful child of the Republic. At the end of April, just 6 weeks from the dictator's death, the young Caesar entered Rome. Antonius was absent at the moment, soliciting the adherence of fresh allies throughout the peninsula, and disgusting even the lax morality of his countrymen by the bold and coarse licentiousness of his private conduct. The royal progress which he made in company with the Grecian courtesan Cytheris was a fitting prelude to the splendour of his ignominious amours which were to follow with the Egyptian Cleopatra, and degraded him to the lowest pitch in the estimation of the patriots and moralists of Rome. Octavius, as it may still be convenient to call the young aspirant to the name and fortunes of Caesar, was at this time less than 19 years of age, but neither his mother Attia nor his stepfather Philippus could dissuade him from claiming his inheritance. He presented himself before the praetor and avowed himself the son and heir of the dictator. He mounted the tribune and harangued the people, pledging himself to discharge the sums bequeathed them by his father, which Antonius had failed to do. But the consul felt no alarm. He cared not to return to Rome before the middle of May, and left the field of intrigue open to his diligent rival for 1 important month. Octavius turned every instant to account, making many friends and conciliating many enemies, till he felt himself strong enough to upbraid Antonius openly with his remissness in prosecuting the assassins. At the same time he publicly laid claim to the treasures which were being withheld from him. Antonius evaded or disallowed the claim. There was no money, he said, forthcoming. The money was not Caesar's, but the state's. But for his own ingenuity, all Caesar's fortune would have been forfeited and his acts annulled. Octavius was thus thrown upon his own resources. He sold all he had, he borrowed of his friends and kinsmen, and effected the discharge of his public obligations. From that moment he assumed a position of authority and power. He had gained the people to his side. He had convinced politicians of his ability and force of character. Antonius now felt that he had to reckon with no mean antagonist, and must determine whether to deal with him as a friend or an enemy. The liberators might give him less uneasiness, for their counsels were vacillating and timid. There was none among them who could take a decided step for the maintenance of the Republic. Cicero, though spirited in tone and patriotic in sentiment, was wholly without power either himself to lead or to breathe animation into his associates. The chief men among them occupied themselves with their private enterprises, of no general interest to their cause. Decimus led his troops against the barbarians in the valleys of the Alps. Cassius withdrew into Syria to seize the command there before his legitimate time of office. Sextus Pompeius made descents upon various points in the western Mediterranean, intent apparently on indiscriminate plunder. Brutus quitted Rome, but lingered on the coast of Campania, whence he gave directions for the praetorial shows which he dared not attend in person. At a later period he made up his mind to anticipate his term of government in Macedonia, but by the time he had crossed the Adriatic, Antonius had already secured the bulk of Caesar's legions in that quarter. The senators already regarded him as their master. When one of their number, Calpurnius Piso, ventured to inveigh against him, his revilings passed unheeded. Though eminent in rank, he had no personal character to support them. Cicero, who had fled reluctantly from Italy, still kept in sight of the shore he loved, and when driven by the weather to come to land in Calabria, refused again to embark, and turned with mournful presentiments toward Rome. The consul had convoked the Senate for September 1st. Cicero had entered the city the day before, and was gratified by his favourable reception. Like other statesmen of his time, he never took account of the excessive instability of the Italian populace. He shrank, however, from attending the sitting of the Senate. Supplications were to be voted, the dead Caesar was to be enrolled among the national divinities, Antonius was present, and soon took advantage of the patriot's absence. The enmity between the two seems to have been instinctive and deep-seated. Cicero had been once banished and his house on the Palatine demolished. Antonius threatened to repeat the injury, but his menaces might be regarded perhaps as mere noisy declamations, and made little impression. The consul carelessly quitted the city to indulge in his licentious orgies at his Tiburtine villa, when Cicero seized the occasion to take his own place among the senators and inveigh in set terms against the adversary who was in his turn absent. These sham duels of the Roman orators, not infrequently recurring, may raise a smile, but in the present instance they have preserved for us some of the most stirring specimens of Roman eloquence. The insults of Antonius had stung Cicero to the quick, and he retorted with the weapon which he found most convenient. First, he vindicated his own conduct, both in leaving the city and in returning to it. While he refrained from any allusion to the tyrannicide, he analyzed the subsequent proceedings of Antonius, and exposed his abuse of Caesar's papers, the posthumous demands he had advanced, the resolutions he had carried through the comitia of the tribes in defiance of the Senate itself. He had recalled whom he would from banishment, made what laws he pleased, appointed his own creatures to office, and pleaded the will of the tyrant for every act of his own selfish and venal policy. The Senate, not less unstable than the populace, warmed into admiration, and seemed for a moment to respond to the enthusiasm of the orator. Antonius himself was roused to fury and hastened back to Rome to make his reply in the Curia. Cicero was more afraid perhaps of his violence than of his arguments. His friends at least persuaded him to avoid a personal collision, and as the one entered the city, the other withdrew into Campania. The Senate seems to have listened obsequiously to whichever in turn claimed its attention. End of section 19. Section 20 of the Roman Triumvirates by Charles Merivale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 10. The Second Triumvirate, Octavius, Antonius, and Lepidus, Part 1. While this war of words was raging, Octavius was silently undermining the consul's power with more effective weapons. With largesses and promises, he was seducing the soldiers from his rival's standards. Antonius learnt with alarm that the troops which he had himself transported to Brundisium were falling under the influence of the young Caesar's emissaries. On October 3rd, he departed in haste to stay their defection. At the same moment, Octavius also quitted Rome and visited the colonies which Caesar had planted in Campania, Umbria, and the Cisalpine. He called the veterans to arms in the name of their beloved captain, and collected among them a force of 10,000 men. At the same time, the heir of the tyrant and usurper was worming himself into the confidence of the unhappy patriot Cicero, who was eager to catch at any hope of support, and through him he worked upon the main body of the Senate. To Cicero he addressed himself in frequent letters, praying him to return to Rome and once more save the state. He promised him regard, admiration, reverence. He loaded him with compliments and caresses. He called him father. Antonius felt that the time was come for vigorous action. The young stripling was an enemy not unworthy of his utmost exertions. He hastened to Ariminum to check the insubordination of the troops then quartered on the frontier of the Cisalpine. He rebuked them for the leaning they had shown to his rival. He offered them a donative. But he had fallen short of the spirit of the times. While he promised 400 sesterces, the captain of the future had assured them of 2,000 apiece. Antonius was, however, still master of the ancient instruments of discipline. He smote their centurions with the axe to the number of 300, if we may believe the furious declamations of Cicero, while his imperious consort Fulvia stood by and stimulated his vengeance. Upon the orator's tirades no reliance can be placed, but it seems that by whatever means Antonius brought some battalions together and repaired with them as a bodyguard to Rome. On his arrival he summoned the Senate to hear his charge against Octavius of raising troops without official authority, for the youthful adventurer was invested with no magistracy. At the same moment, however, he learnt that 2 of his own legions had gone over to his enemy, and that the city could be held against him. There was no place for the consul in the Senate house or the Forum. He must retire to a distance and organize his resources as Sulla and Marius, Caesar and Pompeius had each done in turn. He had given himself the government of the Cisalpine for the year which was about to begin. His first duty as legitimate proconsul would be to drive out Decimus Brutus, whose commission to the same government he declared to be by authority cancelled. He assumed the character of a defender of the Republic and summoned the pretender, who was already on the spot, to withdraw. When he arrived at Ariminum, his forces amounted to 4 legions. Lepidus, who professed to act in concert with him, was advancing from Spain with 4 more. Pollio was still beyond the Pyrenees with 3 others, and Plancus in the further Gaul had under him an equal number. These were the forces on which Antonius deemed that he might rely in his contest with the party of the liberators. But these legions were still widely separated. The soldiers were disloyal or indifferent, and their leaders had each his own private ends to serve. Decimus, from his central position, might intrigue with one or other of them and cut them off from mutual support. But Octavius was now a military power also, having himself raised or detached from Antonius as many as 5 legions. Though possessed of no magistracy, and therefore of no legal imperium, still citizens of all classes thronged about him from various causes, and placed themselves at his disposal. He addressed the Senate with a well-toned manifesto, which immediately recommended him to them as their true champion. Stationing himself at Arretium, so as to cover the capital from the attacks of every other competitor, he awaited the commencement of hostilities in the north of Italy, prepared himself to side with either party, or fall upon the survivor of the strife as circumstances might direct. Such were the complications of this triple contest at the end of November in this fatal year. Cicero, whose courage had revived, was working with restless activity among the senators and citizens at home, striving to consolidate all parties against Antonius. He exhorted Decimus, he caressed Octavius. Doubtless his real disposition inclined to the faction of the liberators, and he might think Decimus the ablest and not the least honest of the number. He could not fail to regard with dislike the nephew and heir of Caesar, but he had been partly won by his dissimulation, and he was content to make use of him as an ally, in full belief that he would either fall from his own weakness or easily succumb to the superior statecraft of a politician so experienced as himself. He engaged the Senate to bestow its honours upon Octavius and give him military command, but he trusted much more to the loyalty of the consuls-elect, Hirtius and Pansa, to raise a force to direct and control him, until the time when the heads of the Republican party, Brutus, Cassius, Trebonius, and Cimber, might be in a position to return to the west with overwhelming armies. Meantime, his efforts were chiefly concentrated on crushing Antonius. The moment had arrived for the publication of the second Philippic, a harangue never delivered by word of mouth, but sent abroad as a written pamphlet after being submitted to the inspection of private friends and polished to the keenest edge by repeated touches from the great master himself. It was the pride of Cicero to compare himself to Demosthenes, the orator and the patriot, and to represent himself as contending against the enemy of Rome, as the Athenian had held in check the invader of Greece. The speech was consummate as a political instrument, as well as a rhetorical composition. It spoke in decided language, branding Caesar as a despot, but Antonius as a monster of iniquity. The author himself it represented as the stay of the commonwealth, the general object of hatred to every enemy of his country. It called on the citizens to arm with frantic earnestness. The effect corresponded to the energy of the blow. The picture drawn of Antonius struck the people with horror. The Senate was at last moved with courage to defy him. The consuls, though personally attached to him, were fixed at once in the interests of the Republic by the applause which hailed this stirring proclamation of its wrongs. Cicero, not unjustly elated by the shouts which echoed around him, believed himself now the mediator between all parties, the actual chief of the commonwealth. It was the noblest as well as the purest triumph of any Roman since the days of Camillus or Africanus. It was the just reward of so many years of self-devotion, and all our painful sense of the weaknesses by which that career had been disfigured, and which even at this moment marred its splendor, may fairly give way to the pleasure of contemplating it. But Antonius replied to words by deeds. He had quietly taken the field and confined Decimus to the walls of Mutina. Cicero urged the Senate and the Senate, at his behest, urged Octavius to attack him. But while he yet abstained from active measures, the friends of Antonius pleaded for forbearance, and the new consuls made yet another effort to preserve peace. Envoys were sent, negotiations were opened, but all failed. Cicero was loud and furious, and was sustained by the favourable accounts which he received from Brutus and Cassius, and the prospect of aid from Sextus. His influence proved effectual. Early in the year 43, Hirtius quitted the city and joined his consular army to the force of Octavius. Pansa reached them in the spring with fresh levies. In the absence of both the consuls, Cicero was allowed and encouraged to take the helm of the Commonwealth. He poured forth in rapid succession his animated harangues against the public enemy. He breathed confidence into the desponding, and redoubled the efforts of the valiant. Clothed in the garb of war, he traversed the streets, calling for contributions to the common cause, and filling the treasury with fines demanded from the malcontents. At the same time he maintained an active correspondence with the chiefs in the provinces, assured each in turn of the constancy of all the others, and brooded far and wide the high spirit of the veterans, the devotion of the people, the fidelity of the generals, and their abundant resources. Yet to the last, the Senate declined to recognize in these movements a state of civil war. Even when they charged Octavius and the consuls to raise the siege of Mutina, they would only characterize the contest as a Gallic tumult, or a threatened outbreak of the national enemy beyond the Rubicon. On the approach of Hirtius and Octavius, Antonius, the assailant of Decamus, broke up from his lines before Mutina and advanced towards them. He still pretended indeed to negotiate, but when Pansa moved to effect a junction with them, he suddenly turned round, defeated, and mortally wounded him. Hirtius, however, was at hand to save the routed force from destruction, and he gave battle to the conqueror a few days later with the support of Octavius. In this encounter the Antonians were in their turn driven into their camp. But the victorious Hirtius fell in the engagement, and thus both the consuls, by an unprecedented fatality, were stricken down at the same moment. The Romans, it would seem, could not believe that such a strange event was mere chance medley. The rumour ran that Octavius had pierced Hirtius in the back with his own hand, a very unlikely circumstance; that he had engaged a surgeon to rub poison into Pansa's wound, a crime in itself less improbable, but on the other hand one which it was only too easy to impute without the possibility of disproving it. The student of Roman history will remark that from this time the insinuation of secret assassination becomes more and more an ordinary weapon of political hostility, and he will put himself on his guard against it. Meanwhile the citizens, high and low, forgot in their rejoicings at the victory the disaster which had attended it. They carried Cicero to the Capitol with the loudest acclamations. He it was that had urged them to the war. In him they recognized the true victor of the field of Mutina. They believed the contest to be at an end. Decamus, they were assured, had issued from his walls and was pursuing the routed Antonians towards the Alps. Plancus, confirmed in his loyalty to the Republic, was doubtless descending from the north and blocking the passes into Gaul. At the same moment, some successes of Cassius against Dolabella in the east, the progress of Brutus in Macedonia, and the rumoured approach of Sextus by sea, all concurred to increase their confidence. Before he expired, Pansa, it was said, had called Octavius to his bedside, and advertised him of the hatred which the Senate really bore him, and of the treachery which they meditated. He assured him that after all his only chance of safety lay in a prompt reconciliation with the enemy whom he had just beaten. Nor was the crafty aspirant unprepared for such counsels. He had already arranged for a quarrel with Decamus, and had declared that the murder of his father Caesar should never be forgiven, He now let Antonius understand that he had no desire to crush his father's friend. He refrained from preventing the junction which he was about to make with Lepidus beyond the Po. Antonius himself was evincing the courage and fortitude under adverse circumstances for which, voluptuary though he was, he obtained high credit among his countrymen. He was a powerful example, says Plutarch, to his soldiers, for though he was fresh from the enjoyment of so much luxury and expense, he drank foul water without complaining, and ate wild fruits and roots. He induced them in their flight to feed with him on the bark of trees and on the flesh of strange animals. Fortune seconded his energy. Plancus terminated his long indecision by throwing himself into the arms of the party which now, since the junction with Lepidus and the encouragement shown by Octavius, was manifestly the stronger. Antonius found himself at the head of 23 legions. This was the dreadful fact to which the Senate now awoke from their dream of easy triumph. While expecting the arrival of Brutus and Cassius with overwhelming armies, they had sought to amuse their younger champion and at the same time to corrupt his soldiers. Cicero was himself prepared to cast away the broken instrument of his successful policy. The Senate, which had procured Octavius his election to the praetorship, now refused him the dignity of consul. 400 of his veterans came in a body to Rome to press his claim. The Senate still refused, and he crossed the Rubicon at the head of 8 legions. The Senate forbade him to approach within 90 miles of the city. At the same time, however, they yielded to his demand and offered a donative to his soldiers. But it was now too late. The bold adventurer had determined on his course and did not halt till he reached the gates. The senators were appalled at this unlooked-for resolution. While putting forth a feeble show of defence, they slipped one by one into the intruder's camp. Cicero, indeed, was more constant than any, but he too yielded at last to the current and presented himself before Octavius. He was received with taunts for his slackness. His fears were awakened, perhaps his conscience smote him. He might remember that he had himself urged with grim levity that the young candidate should be smothered with honours, and the next night he made his escape. The people hastily assembled, pretended to elect Octavius to the consulship, and gave him a kinsman named Pedius for his colleague. This was September 22nd. On the following day he completed his 20th year. The remnant of the senators, for many had disappeared, loaded him with flatteries and honours. They issued an empty command that Decimus should surrender to him his forces. Octavius directed the murderers of Caesar to be cited before the public tribunals, judgment passed against them by default, and they were interdicted fire and water. End of section 20. Section 21 of the Roman Triumvirates by Charles Merivale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 10. The Second Triumvirate. Octavius, Antonius, and Lepidus. Part 2. The helpless upstart of the year before was now actually at the head of affairs, and could offer his own terms to whichever of the contending parties he should choose for his ally. While causing the hasty decrees of the Senate against Antonius and Lepidus to be rescinded, he made them overtures which were readily accepted. Placed between these two chiefs and their respective powers, abandoned by Plancus, receiving no support from Octavius and the government at Rome, Decimus was lost. His troops, which had been easily levied, not less easily deserted him. The old military devotion to the general was utterly forgotten, even among the followers of a republican standard. With a few horsemen he attempted to break away into Macedonia through the passes of the Rhaetian Alps, but he was baffled by the mountaineers, and was delivered by a chief named Camellus into the hands of Antonius, by whom he was put to death. The blood of the tyrannicide cemented the alliance between the friend and the heir of the tyrant. Towards the end of October, the Caesarian leaders, Antonius, Lepidus, and Octavius, each at the head of independent, if not of equal forces, met near Bononia on an islet in the broad channel of a shallow stream called the Rhenus, and there deliberated on the fate of the vanquished and the partition of the common spoil. It was arranged between them, after 3 days' parley, that Octavius should resign the consulship in favour of Ventidius, a rude but trusty officer of the Antonian army, while the 3 superior chiefs should reign in partnership together over the city, the consuls, and the laws. They claimed the consular power without the official title, in common for a period of 5 years, with the right of appointing to all the magistracies. Their decrees were to have the force of law, without requiring the confirmation of the Senate or the people. To this extraordinary commission, if we may so entitle a usurpation to which no other power but themselves was a party, they gave the name of a triumvirate, or board of 3, for constituting the commonwealth. The appointment of boards similarly designated for special purposes was an arrangement well known to the Roman constitution. The quindecimvirs, the septemvirs, and the sevirs were each a permanent college for the discharge of certain sacred functions. The decemvirs, of famous memory, had been specially charged with the settlement of the civil law of the state, and with its temporary government while that settlement was pending. All of these had emanated directly from the suffrage of the people, and held their power subject to the popular will. But the triumvirate now established owned no such popular origin, and bore no such elective character. It was an open and wilful usurpation. It was a provisional government, as we might now call it, self-appointed in the first instance, standing upon its own basis, propped by an armed force, holding out indeed a prospect of self-surrender at some future time, but prepared meanwhile to assert its own arbitrary authority and require universal obedience to it. The so-called triumvirate of Caesar, Pompeius, and Crassus had made no such public or patent assertion of conjoint power. The earlier triumvirs obtained the title rather as a nickname than as indicating an established fact. They held similar power to that of their successors, but they put forth no actual profession of it. The idea of a Roman tyranny had made great advances in the popular mind during the 15 years which had intervened. It was the partition of absolute power between 3, instead of its concentration in the hands of a single chief, that constituted the only essential difference between the despotism of the triumvirs and the despotism of a king. The promise to resign the appointment at the end of 5 years was perceived to be merely illusory. The only hope the citizens could entertain of its fulfilment lay in the dissension which might be expected to prevail between the 3 co-equal occupants. And so it was that the alliance of the triumvirs came indeed to a rapid end. But the end, as might have been equally well foreseen, was not the restoration of the popular government, but the consolidation of an absolute monarchy. Meanwhile, according to the first partition made between them, the 2 Gauls fell to Antonius, the Spains with the Narbonenses to Lepidus, Africa and the islands of Sicily and Sardinia to Octavius. Italy itself, the seat of empire, the 3 were to retain in common, while the eastern provinces now held by Brutus and Cassius they left for future division when the enemy should be expelled from them. Against this enemy war was to be at once declared. Octavius and Antonius, each with 20 legions, charged themselves with the conduct of the war, and agreed to leave Lepidus, the least ambitious and least stirring of the confederates, but a man of high position, great wealth, and wide connections, to maintain their combined interest in the city. The swordsmen who followed them with no public or patriotic principles were merely held together by the hopes of plunder, or at best by the military instinct of confidence in their leaders. Ample gratuities were poured into their hands, and estates assigned them from the lands of 18 of the cities of Italy. The war was to be carried beyond the limits of the peninsula, but it was the peninsula itself which suffered the first and perhaps the worst effects of civil dissension. The troops, however, were satisfied with their share in the common compact, and insisted that it should be ratified by the espousal of Octavius to the daughter whom Fulvia had borne to her first husband, the tribune Clodius. The triumvirs now addressed an order to Pedius at Rome for the slaughter of 17 of their principal adversaries. The houses of these selected victims were attacked at night, and most of them had fallen before their condemnation was notified to the citizens. Pedius, a brave and honourable man, died from horror and disgust at the crime he was imperiously required to execute. Octavius, Antonius, and Lepidus then entered the city on 3 successive days, each attended by a single legion. The temples and towns were occupied by the troops, the banners of the conquerors waved in the forum, and cast their ominous shadow over the heads of the assembled citizens. A plebiscitum was required to give a bare semblance of legality to an usurpation which had been already effected. On November 27th, 43 BC, the triumvirate was proclaimed. The potentates, about to quit Rome to combat the murderers of Caesar in the east, would leave no enemies in their rear. They decreed not a massacre such as Sulla's, but a formal proscription. Sitting with a list of chief citizens before them, each picked out the names of the victims he personally required. Each purchased the right to proscribe a kinsman of his colleagues by surrendering one of his own. The fatal memorial was headed with the names of a brother of Lepidus, an uncle of Antonius, and a cousin of Octavius. Again were enacted the brutal scenes which closed the civil wars of the last generation. Centurions and soldiers were dispatched in quest of the most important victims. The pursuit was joined by mercenary cutthroats and private enemies. Slaves attacked their masters, and debtors their creditors. The heads of the victims were affixed to the rostra to certify the claims of the murderers, but the triumvirs themselves did not always pause to identify them. The cold and unnatural cruelty of some of these assassinations has made them more peculiarly odious, even amidst the many butcheries of the Roman civil wars. It would seem, however, that the proscribed were not in all cases hotly pursued. Many crossed the sea to Macedonia, others into Africa. Still more took refuge on board the vessels with which Sextus Pompeius was cruising off the coast of Italy. Some escaped by bribery when entreaty failed, and Octavius seems in some cases to have set his own leniency in contrast with the more brutal ferocity of his associates. But Antonius had demanded the death of Cicero, and Octavius, to the horror of all time, had consented. Nevertheless, some opportunity was given even to Cicero to effect his escape, and he was not overtaken till a month later. Marcus Cicero was at the moment with his brother Quintus at his Tusculan villa. On the first rumour of the proscription, they fled and gained Astura, another of the orator's residences on a little island off Antium. From thence they proposed to embark for Macedonia. Quintus, indeed, was promptly seized and slain, but the surviving fugitive reached the sea, set sail again, landed again embarked and landed once more at Formiae, worn out with distress of mind and suffering from sickness. In vain was he warned of the danger of delay. "Let me die," he exclaimed, "in my fatherland, which I have so often saved." But his slaves now lifted him with gentle violence into his litter and hurried him toward the coast. Scarcely had the house been quitted when an officer named Popilius, a client, it was said, whose life Cicero had saved, approached and thundered at the closed doors. A traitor pointed out the direction which the fugitive had taken, and Cicero had not yet reached the beach when he saw the pursuers gaining upon him. His own party was numerous and would have fought in his defence, but he forbade them. He bade his slaves set down the litter, and with his eyes fixed steadily on the murderers, offered his throat to the sword. Some covered their faces with their hands, and their agitated leader drew his blade thrice across it before he could sever the head from the body. The bloody trophy was carried to Rome and set up by Antonius in front of the rostra. He openly exulted in the spectacle and rewarded the assassins with profuse liberality. Fulvia, the wife of Antonius and the relic of Clodius, pierced, it is said, the tongue with a needle, in revenge for the sarcasms it had uttered against both her husbands. In the circumstances both of his life and death, Cicero has been compared to Demosthenes. Each struggled for his country against an enemy and a tyrant, and each was proscribed and hunted to death for the eloquence with which he had assailed him. Each battled for a cause which was really hopeless, for both Athens and Rome had forfeited the power of maintaining their own freedom, perhaps we may say the right to contend for it. But if the crimes of Roman society were more glaring than those of the Athenian, which was imbecile rather than furious, there were at least some great and noble characters in the Senate who might dignify the struggle, however hopeless. Among the magnates of the city to whom Cicero introduces us in his letters and his speeches, there were men of virtue and honour, true lovers of their country and admirers of patriotism such as his own. They lacked perhaps the genuine devotion of the older days, and with the single exception, it may be said, of Cato, have left us no historic examples of public virtue. The best among them were no doubt more conscious of the false position in which they were placed by the corruption of their own adherents and the evil temper of the times. But the best of them were indeed among the weakest in character and least capable of influencing the multitude around them. Cicero himself was not, except once or twice, for a moment only, a real power in the state. But he has left as statesman an example of sincere patriotism to which the lovers of public virtue may always point with exultation. To the last, he never deserted his place as a citizen. He has enriched human history with the portrait which the gods were said to admire, of a good man struggling with adversity, and the respect in which his own countrymen held him, both in his own time and in later generations, is a redeeming feature in the hard and selfish character of the Roman people. Such were the atrocities and horrors with which the year B.C. 43 closed. Lepidus and Plancus, who next entered on the consulship, commanded the people, still full of dismay and mourning, to celebrate the commencement of their reign with mirth and festivity. They demanded the honour of a triumph for victories about which our annals are silent, in Gaul and Spain. Both the one and the other had sacrificed their own brother in the proscription, and when the fratricides passed along in their chariots, the soldiers, it is said with the usual camp license, chanted as they followed, "The consul's triumph, not over the Gauls, but the Germans, that is, their brothers." The massacres had now ended, but a course of confiscation commenced. All the inhabitants of Rome and Italy were required to lend 1/10 of their fortunes, and to give the whole of 1 year's income. The consuls proposed an oath to the citizens to maintain all Caesar's enactments, and they proceeded to accord to him divine honours by an oriental fiction unknown at least to the Romans since the legendary days of Romulus. The triumvirs followed their hero's example in assigning all the chief magistracies for several years in advance. Octavius undertook to drive Sextus out of Sicily, where he had established himself under the protection of a flotilla manned by pirates and adventurers. But the passage of the narrow straits was too strictly guarded. Antonius crossed without delay to the coast of Epirus. End of section 21. Section 22 of the Roman Triumvirates by Charles Merivale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 11. Last effort of the Republicans, the Battle of Philippi. The conduct of the struggle which was now about to open affords an instructive view of the condition of the Roman dominion in the last days of the victorious Commonwealth. We have seen the alacrity with which Cassius, the chief military leader of the Republican party, hastened to throw himself into the remote East and assume the government of the Syrian province. He found himself there at the head of a large army supported by levies from many states and tributary potentates, sustained by the unbounded resources of the wealthiest region of the known world, constituting an independent power but slightly connected in political feeling with Rome itself, and long disused to the restraints of civil law. An army encamped upon a subject territory on which it claimed to live at free quarters. The only rule which it acknowledged was that of its own commander, and this rule it obeyed only so far as he gratified its appetite for plunder and its ordinary contempt of discipline. The great army of the East would follow its leader to any enterprise of conquest among the wealthy regions of Asia, but it did not care to cross the seas and encounter the defenders of the poorer realms of Europe. It preferred the sack of cities and temples to an assignment of lands, and it was dimly conscious that on the soil of Italy its victories could not be crowned by the pillage of Rome, nor even that of Capua or Naples. The veterans of Sulla and Pompeius must be content when they transferred themselves from the East to the shores of Italy with the tardy acquisition of forfeited estates and the position of military colonists. Accordingly, the forces of Cassius were all-powerful at Antioch and Ephesus, but they were of little avail for the reconquest of the Western world. Brutus, as we have seen, had been more loath to quit Rome. His patriotic spirit was attached, like that of Cicero, to the home and centre of his nation, and could ill brook the prospect of a long and perhaps a final separation from it. But he, too, as a student of Hellenic culture, was attracted to the East, as far at least as Greece and Athens, by its scholastic associations, and the command which he had secured for himself in Macedonia brought him into direct contact with the men of thought and learning who still congregated from all parts, and especially from Rome herself, in the schools of the Porch, the Garden, and the Academy. Athens was at this time much frequented by the young nobility of Italy. Many who came in their tender years for the purpose of study conceived a special attachment to the place, which weaned them from their own country and made Greece a second home to them. The Romans in Greece constituted a provincial society which owned but a languid allegiance to their native city, and cared perhaps little for their natural connection with it. Among the youthful students of the Athenian University, if we may so entitle it, Brutus enlisted many gallant spirits, such as the young poet Horace, who were fired by the name of liberty, but were more ready to defend themselves in their adopted country against an invader from the west than to make any attempt to recover a footing on the shores which they had virtually abandoned. If we may compare this state of things with an instance from modern history, the Romans at this period in the East were in some marked respects not unlike the people of the southern states of North America. Desirous as they were chiefly of being left alone in the enjoyment of their peculiar advantages, the Romans of the West like the northerners of the transatlantic continent, would not suffer them to depart, being determined that the empire should not be divided, and that the wealthiest portion of their dominions should not be wrested from the common centre. Doubtless, if there was much patriotism in this determination, there was at the same time much greed of power. But so it was that the government installed at Rome would never consent to the separation of the East from the West. The Caesarians would not suffer such a separation to be effected by the Pompeians, who, for their part, might not be unwilling to acquiesce in it. The followers of the triumvirs would not concede it to the republicans, who in their turn would have made little effort to oppose it. And again, at the next turn of fortune to which we shall be directed, we shall find the triumvir, who is master of the West, inexorable in his resolution to recover the eastern half of the empire from his rival beyond the Aegean. It was, in fact, with the utmost difficulty that at 3 successive crises the unity of the whole unwieldy mass was preserved, and at last so firmly welded together by Augustus and Agrippa that it endured without a rupture, though not without some violent shocks, for nearly 4 centuries. To the last, however, the union was mechanical, so to say, rather than organic. There was no community of interest, no homogeneous feeling, no moral fusion between the East and the West. The 2 hemispheres were maintained in political union only as they had been first compacted by the firm will and strong hand of Rome. The horrible condition to which the civil wars had reduced the long-flourishing communities of the East appears in a way in which the Roman chiefs in that quarter were obliged to maintain their armies. As soon as Antonius threatened them with an attack, it became necessary to arm and move the vast hosts which could be easily raised to confront him. The most forcible measures were demanded to supply the means required. This want of means would have prevented any aggressive movement, even had the liberators and those that followed them really cared to carry the war into Italy. But in fact, they could not attempt to do so. The legionaries themselves might have refused to engage in a bloody and unprofitable campaign, while the cities of the East offered them abundant gratifications. They found or provoked petty enemies around them, and compelled their chiefs to lead them against the Lycians, the Rhodians, and the Cappadocians, either for pay or plunder. Brutus himself consented to the sack of Xanthus, where the wretched people threw themselves into the flames of their own city. Cassius wantonly attacked the great emporium of Rhodes, mulcted it of 8,500 talents, and enforced the fine by cutting off the heads of 50 of its principal citizens. The whole province of Asia was subjected to the severest proscriptions, of which these are perhaps only specimens. At last, Brutus, hardly less guilty than his colleagues, but more sensitive to the sin and scandal, interfered to restrain such disgraceful cruelties. At Sardis, where the 2 proconsuls met to arrange their plan of operations, he sharply rebuked Cassius for bringing odium on their common cause. But Cassius pleaded his inability to restrain his mercenaries, and Brutus let the matter pass with a few unavailing murmurs. The character of Brutus as a dreamy enthusiast is marked by the venerable legend of a terrible figure that appeared to him at night, and denounced itself as his evil demon, which should present itself to him again at Philippi. It was reported further that Brutus divulged the ominous vision to Cassius the Epicurean, who explained to him the reasoning by which his master in philosophy had demonstrated the vanity of apparitions. Nevertheless, the Stoic idealist continued anxious and dissatisfied. When at last the republican forces mustered in 42 BC in Macedonia, in the vicinity of Philippi, 100,000 strong, and prepared to encounter the armies still more numerous of the triumvirs, the vision, it is said, recurred. The demon was faithful to his appointment. Never were men's eyes and ears more open to bodings of evil than at this disturbed crisis of human history. The ghosts of Marius and Sulla were supposed to have betokened the renewal of the civil wars. The disaster of Carrhae had been preceded by adverse omens. The battle of Pharsalia had been announced hundreds of miles away at the moment of the impious struggle. Presages of dire significance had been noticed before that fell encounter. Similar intimations, it would seem, could not be wanting to the last fatal scene which was now about to open. Brutus and Cassius posted themselves on two eminences about 12 miles east of Philippi, their left covered by the sea from which they drew their supplies. Antonius placed his camp opposite to that of Cassius. Octavius, on his left, faced the army of Brutus. Cassius, it is said, aware of the enemy's lack of provisions, would have refrained from action. But Brutus, ever fretful and impatient, overruled his wiser counsels. The contest between forces so numerous extended over a wide space and was conducted with little mutual concert between the commanders on either side. Octavius was sick and could not take part in the encounter. More than once in the course of his career did he suffer these untoward hindrances, upon which his enemies did not fail to comment. And now his division was overpowered and precipitately pursued. Brutus believed the battle won, but in the meanwhile Antonius had charged with no less success on the right. Cassius had been driven from his camp, and descrying, when left almost alone, a body of horsemen advancing, had rashly concluded that they were enemies in pursuit, and had thrown himself upon the sword of a freedman. The scouts of Brutus, sent to advertise him of his colleague's advantage, arrived a moment too late. The effect of this blunder was disastrous. Cassius had exercised some control over the soldiers, but Brutus was utterly powerless with them. In vain did he scatter all his treasures among them. They called out the louder for more. In vain did he yield up his prisoners to their cruelty. They grew even more vindictive and bloodthirsty. He was compelled to promise them the plunder of Thessalonica in order to retain them yet a while at his standard. For the Caesarians were reduced to great straits, and the dispersion of their fleet on the same day as the recent battle rendered their advanced position no longer tenable. Both the armies still kept the ground which they had before occupied. 20 days after the first engagement, Brutus was hurried into renewing it. The field was well contested. The instinct of fighting was equally keen on both sides, though on neither was there any real principle at stake, nor any definite object in view. The Roman legionary had become nothing more than a gladiator, bold, expert, and desperate. At the end of the day the Caesarians had broken the ranks of their adversaries, and Octavius assailed them in their camp. Brutus, with 4 legions, kept the position through the night on the neighbouring hills. The next day his men refused to fight, and he could only secure with a few attendants some hours of concealment, after which he terminated his life with a blow of his own sword, when none of them could be induced to do him the last faithful service. The cause of the Republic is said to have perished on the field of Philippi. But to speak truly, the Republic itself had, as we have seen, perished already. The fragments of the broken party which had seemed to gather round it collapsed under this final blow. Many nobles and officers who survived the carnage were captured in the flight or surrendered themselves to the victors, who treated them, strange to say, with distinguished clemency. A remnant was taken off by their own fleet and sought refuge with Sextus at the head of his piratical armament. The Caesarian leaders had shown themselves abler than their opponents. A curse of weakness and barrenness seemed to cling to the murderers of the great dictator, who proved themselves incompetent throughout to originate any bold design, to overcome any difficulties, or to engender even the slightest enthusiasm for the phantom which they followed. Brutus, the best, but perhaps the weakest of the whole crew, died muttering a spiritless verse which rails at virtue as an empty name, and no better than a slave to fortune. If so it be, he should surely have bethought himself thereof before he gratified his spite or vanity by the crime of assassination. Amidst the fury, indeed, of armed factions, it was plain that the government of the world had passed out of the hands of contemplative and philosophical students, if such could have ever hoped to retain it. The strong man was the only man who could rule, and the strong man was more than ever necessary to prevent the world from sinking into anarchy. The true patriot at that moment would have hailed the advent of any ruler vigorous enough to control events, and might have forgiven him an act of usurpation in which lay the only chance of progress, or at least of peace, for the future. But the vain idea that the Republic was possible now passed out of men's minds, never again to be revived, except casually and for a moment in the imagination of hot-headed and feeble enthusiasts. There yet remained a short struggle before the personal claims of the foremost captains of the day, but the Commonwealth in general might await with some calmness the issue, which could only be the establishment of a constituted government under the form of monarchy. From the Republic to the Empire might be a moral decline, but it was plainly both natural and inevitable. End of section 22. Section 23 of the Roman Triumvirates by Charles Merivale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 12. Contest between Octavius and Antonius. Battle of Actium. Octavius becomes master of the state. Part 1. The two triumvirs who had conducted the campaign against the common enemy paid little regard to the colleague whom they had left in empty state behind them. After Philippi, they arranged a new division of the provinces, Antonius taking Gaul and Illyricum, Octavius seizing upon Spain and Numidia, and retaining Italy with the Cisalpine in common between the two, while to Lepidus they gave at first no province at all, though at a later period they allowed him to hold the small but important district of Africa. This partition of the provinces seems to have been made in order to allow each chief to gratify his particular followers with subordinate appointments, but the real distribution of power was of a different kind. Octavius returned to Rome and became at once supreme throughout the West, while Antonius preferred to remain in the opposite quarter and reign over its wealthy regions and luxurious cities, which were all placed in subjection to him. While Octavius devoted himself in Italy to the interests of his veterans, his colleague lavished upon himself and his parasites all the spoils he could accumulate. His arrival was everywhere regarded with the utmost dread by cities and potentates, and his favour purchased by flatteries and presents. The clever and artful Cleopatra addressed him, however, in another fashion. The death of her admirer Caesar exposed her to imminent perils at Alexandria, both from within and from without. It was essential to her security to gain the protection of the new ruler of the East. Antonius had seen her in the train of his master, and even then, no doubt, had been struck by her showy fascinations. She had returned to Egypt to secure her throne there. But he now required her to meet him in Cilicia and answer for some imputed intrigues with his enemy Cassius. The queen was confident in her charms, which had already proved so powerful. Instead of appearing herself as a suppliant, she meant to bring him on his knees before her, and she succeeded. Steering for Tarsus for the interview demanded of her, She sailed up the Cydnus in a gilded vessel with purple sails and silver oars to the sound of oriental music. She was seen reclining under a spangled canopy in the garb of Venus, surrounded by Cupids, Graces, and Nereids. Antonius himself had jovially assumed the attributes of Bacchus. The astonished natives hailed the happy conjunction of the two most genial of their divinities. Dazzled by her splendid equipage, he invited her to land and sit at banquet with him. But she haughtily replied that he must come and attend upon herself. The first interview sealed his fate. For the rude triumvir, more of a gladiator than a statesman, Cleopatra discarded the Grecian elegance of manners which had charmed the polished dictator. She sat through his tipsy orgies, laughed at his camp jokes, delighted him with her own saucy sallies, and so maintained the hold which she at once acquired over him, till she first ruined and finally betrayed him. While, however, Antonius was forgetting wife and country, and postponing the war announced against the Parthians for the sake of his new plaything, his brother Lucius had joined with Fulvia in a wanton attack upon Octavius in Italy. Lucius Antonius and Servilius had occupied the consulship for the year 41. Fulvia, daring and ambitious, ruled them both, while the indolent Lepidus fell altogether under eclipse. The return of Octavius surprised and alarmed the guilty confederates. Fulvia was irritated by his dismissal of her daughter Claudia, whom he had but just wedded to satisfy the soldiers. She was mortified also at her husband's desertion, and hoped to tear him away from Alexandria by raising commotions at home. With these views, she fomented the discontent of the Italian proprietors, whose lands Octavius had assigned to his veterans, many of whom had already seized their arms to defend themselves, while the veterans themselves were murmuring at the discontent which their victims so naturally manifested. The young triumvir was reduced to great straits. He exerted himself to pacify his followers with fresh confiscations, but his friend Marcus Agrippa shut up Lucius in Perugia, and at last reduced him to capitulation by stress of hunger in 41 BC. It is said that Octavius caused 300 knights and senators to be sacrificed to the shade of his father, but the story of the Auri Perusii seems little credible, though doubtless his brutal soldiery thirsted for blood, and perhaps he gratified them too largely. We learn, however, that at all events he spared Lucius Antonius, and even gave him an appointment in Spain. Antonius was now roused to exertion, and for a moment he broke away from the toils of his Egyptian paramour. He sent his lieutenant Ventidius to make head against the Parthians, whose hostility, ever ready to kindle in arms, he had already challenged, but he shaped his own course for the west. At Athens he met his consort Fulvia, who upbraided him with his long abandonment of wife and friends. But as he was exerting himself just then to repair his error, the rebuke was at least unseasonable, and his resentment seems to have crushed her spirit and hastened her end, which quickly followed. Relieved from this domestic embarrassment, he led his active squadrons to the coast of the Adriatic. There he made a compact with Sextus Pompeius, and got himself transported across the straits. But the plunder which he seems to have allowed raised the indignation of Italy and Rome, which had learned to regard him as a foreign invader. In Sextus, his base associate, they had long ceased to recognize the son of their ancient favorite. The prince of the pirates had renounced, it was reported, the manners and principles of his countrymen, and affected to be the son of Neptune, and had actually forgotten the Latin language. Accordingly, when Octavius drew his sword to resist this invasion, the sympathies of the people were enlisted warmly on his side as the champion of the Senate, the people, and the national divinities. The soldiers, however, were at this moment stronger than the people, and disposed of their chiefs at their will. They now compelled the two rival leaders to treat. A fresh partition of the empire gave the east to Antonius from the Adriatic to the Euphrates, where he was charged to control the Parthians; the west to Octavius, with the conduct of the war against Sextus. Africa was abandoned to Lepidus. Octavia, the sister of the young Caesar, recently left a widow by Marcellus, married the widower Antonius 40 BC. The rivals, thus outwardly reunited, hastened to Rome together and celebrated their alliance with much hollow rejoicing. The Treaty of Brundisium gave to each of the two contracting parties a new start in power, but it put no check upon their rivalry. The final issue of the long struggle between them, thus carefully balanced, must depend upon personal ability and fortune. The popularity which the younger had already acquired gave him a ground of vantage, but he had 3 arduous tasks before him: to keep Rome and Italy contented, to contend at the same time by sea against the resources and skill of Sextus, and to maintain by constant exercise the courage and ardor of his soldiers. In the first of these undertakings he was ably seconded by Silnius Maecenas, whom he made his chief administrator at home, who soothed rival ambitions in the Senate and the Forum, and pacified the murmurs of the dispossessed proprietors throughout the peninsula. His next endeavour was to come to terms with Sextus, with whom he had connected himself by an opportune marriage with his sister Scribonia. The son of the great Pompeius was now invited to confer with the triumvirs at Misenum, and the islands of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica were assigned to him as his share of empire. The allied potentates entertained one another at banquets in a vessel riding at sea, but moored to the land for the equal security of all. And Sextus gallantly declined, though not without an effort, to let his bold lieutenant Minus cut the cable and carry off his rivals with him. But when he refused to restore some places he had taken on the coast of Italy, the western triumvir took up arms against him. In his naval enterprises, Octavius was well supported by his friend Agrippa, who constructed the Julian port on the Campanian coast, employed 1 year in equipping a powerful fleet, and after some misadventures effected his enemy's complete overthrow in the sea fight of Naulochus off the coast of Sicily, 37 BC. Sextus fled in confusion to the east and was speedily crushed by Antonius, to whom he vainly looked for protection. Octavius had already repudiated Scribonia, and allied himself with the great houses of the Republic by a curious love marriage with Livia, divorced for his sake by her husband Tiberius Claudius Nero. The term prescribed for the triumvirate had expired on the last day of the year 38, but there had been many precedents for the protraction of such irregular powers, and the 3 colleagues were on sufficiently good terms with one another to agree to a renewal of their compact for another period of 5 years in 37 BC. The Senate and the people submitted without an audible murmur to a tyranny which was now more autocratic than ever. Such, it seems, was the result of a meeting of Octavius and Antonius at Tarentum, in which they pretended to maintain a cordial alliance between themselves, while they retained their superiority over their feeble colleague. When Lepidus ventured at last to turn against the ruler of the West, Octavius easily put down so feeble a pretender, and spared the life of a magnate illustrious from his birth and from the dignity which he held of chief pontiff. The younger Caesar had now learnt from the elder the policy of clemency, which he continued to practice to the end of his long career. He was cementing his power and popularity in every direction with a view, no doubt, to the final struggle which he knew to be impending, and his last efforts were directed to keeping his troops in training by campaigns against the barbarians in Dalmatia, where neither spoil nor glory was to be acquired, but which now presented the only field for the arms of a Western imperator. On the other hand, a great sphere was opened to the martial enterprise of the triumvir in the East. Antonius had acted loyally toward his colleague in supplying him with vessels for his contest with Sextus. At the same time, he had required from him a contingent of 20,000 men for the expedition which he was preparing to conduct against the Parthians. Having secured this succour, however, he did not scruple to abandon the sister of Octavius, whom he had so recently espoused as a pledge of constant alliance, and rushed again into the toils of Cleopatra, with whom he indulged in sport and revelry till his armaments were completed. About midsummer of the year B.C. 36, he had assembled 100,000 men on the Euphrates to follow up the partial successes of Ventidius. He had indeed delayed the advance too long, and from the haste with which he now moved, he suffered his machines to fall into the rear, so that when he reached Prospa, 300 miles beyond the Tigris unopposed, he found himself destitute of the means for besieging a strong and well-defended city. An attempt to reduce it by blockade was baffled by the setting in of the cold season in the lofty regions into which he had unwarily plunged. He retreated, and suffered in his retreats hardships almost unparalleled, such as those which attended the flight of Napoleon from Moscow. On his crossing the Araxes, however, the Parthians at length desisted from their pursuit, but still intent on regaining the festive halls of Alexandria, he hurried his weary soldiers along with great distress and loss. He rejoined the queen in Syria, whither she had advanced to meet him, and returned with her defeated but unabashed to the delights of her court in Egypt. So miserable a retreat after so rash an advance could be regarded only as a grave disaster. The base triumvir chose, however, to announce himself as a conqueror. Octavius did not care to contest his claim, and still affected to maintain a cordial understanding with him. Antonius had quitted Alexandria, bent upon another campaign in the East. Octavius, sent with specious compliments by her brother, had gone forward to meet him, bringing with her some picked battalions, well armed and clothed, with other valuable equipments for his army. She hoped even now to win him away from his disgraceful amour with the foreigner. Cleopatra was on watch to baffle her endeavours. The queen soon succeeded in luring her lover back to Egypt. Octavia returned with dignity to Rome, B.C. 35, at last abandoning her reckless lord to the fate which he merited. Antonius grew more and more insensible to the opinions of his countrymen. In the following year, B.C. 34, he made some inroads into Armenia, picked a quarrel with the king Artavasdes, and carried him, loaded with golden chains, to Alexandria. For these successes he awarded himself a triumph, which he celebrated to the disgust of all Roman citizens in the streets of his barbaric capital. End of section 23. Section 24 of the Roman Triumvirates by Charles Merivale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 12. Contest between Octavius and Antonius. Battle of Actium. Octavius becomes master of the state. Part 2. The first months of the year 33 were passed at Alexandria amidst licentious orgies, the rumour of which caused much resentment at Rome, where they were no doubt depicted in the darkest colours. The aim of Cleopatra, it was urged, was to wean the Roman imperator from his national ideas, to make him a foreigner and an Egyptian like herself, to render it impossible for him to show himself again in Rome. This she might perhaps easily effect, but it was more difficult for her to keep the idle voluptuary constantly occupied and constantly amused. Her personal qualities were of the most varied kind, and such as we might suppose would have been lost upon a coarse debauchee like Antonius. She was an admirable singer and musician. She was skilled in many languages and possessed of high intellectual gifts, in addition to the lighter artifices of her sex. She pampered her lover's appetites and stimulated his flagging interest with ingenious surprises and playful ridicule, sending divers, as we read, to fasten a salted fish to the bait of his angling rod, and dissolving in a cup of vinegar a pearl of inestimable value. Painters and sculptors were charged to group the illustrious pair together, and the coins of the realm represented the effigies of the two conjointly. The Roman legionary bore the name of Cleopatra on his shield like a Macedonian bodyguard. Masks were represented at court in which the versatile Plancus sank into the character of a stage buffoon and enacted the part of the sea god Glaucus, while the princely lovers arrayed themselves as the native divinities Isis and Osiris. Meanwhile, the Senate had decreed Octavius a legitimate triumph for his successes over the Liburni and the Iapides. He had sustained an honourable wound, and had recovered his reputation for personal courage, on which some slur had been cast by his unseasonable sicknesses. But the youthful hero was not impatient for the celebration of his victory, and deferred the solemnity, while he kept the city in intense expectation of a national crisis, by upbraiding Antonius with his foreign connection, and pointing to him as an enemy to the Commonwealth. Antonius, on his part, had charges also to make against his colleague. These were personal indeed, rather than patriotic. He complained that his just share of the spoils of Lepidus had been withheld from him. But such a complaint met with no response from the Senate and people, and Octavius could well afford to disregard it. The Eastern chief began now to prepare in earnest for a final struggle. He had been collecting troops for another attack upon the Parthians. Toward the end of 33 BC, he directed his forces westward, appointing Ephesus for the rendezvous of the contingents from many provinces and nations which he summoned to his standards. Greeks, Asiatics, and Africans found themselves arrayed around him. Cleopatra appeared herself at the head of the great Egyptian navy. Her galleys were renowned for their size and splendid equipment, and combined with the resources of the eastern Mediterranean to form the largest armament that had ever been launched on its waters, at least since the time of Xerxes. The consuls for the year 32 were Domitius Ahenobarbus and Sosius, both of them adherents of Antonius, who had received their office according to the agreement then still existing between him and his colleague. But this advantage was balanced by the defection of some of his chief supporters. Plancus, who had consented to degrade himself for the amusement of his patron's court, now reappeared in the Senate and denounced his treachery and frivolity. This man betrayed to Octavius the testament of the renegade imperator, which he had been charged to deposit with the Vestal virgins, and in which, it seems, Antonius had acknowledged the validity of Caesar's odious union with the foreigner, had declared her child Cesario to be the dictator's legitimate son, had confirmed his own donations of crowns and provinces to his bastards, and finally had directed that his own body should be entombed by the side of Cleopatra's in the mausoleum of the Ptolemies. None could now doubt the rumours which prevailed, that he had pledged the queen and his cups to remove the government of the world to Alexandria and prostrate the gods of the capital before the monstrous deities of the Nile. Octavius was at once greeted as the true champion of the nation, the maintainer of its principles and its faith. The consuls hurried away from the city, in which they found themselves ill at ease. Octavius, still moderate, still politic, refrained from declaring the impious chief a public enemy. He was content with proclaiming war against Egypt. The second term of the triumvirate had expired, and he did not renew it. He directed the Senate to annul the appointment of Antonius to the next consulship, and assumed it himself with Messala for the year 31. Even the handful of nobles who repaired at this crisis to the side of Antonius now urged him to dismiss Cleopatra and reduce the impending struggle to a personal contest with his rival. He replied by formally divorcing his legitimate consort, and thus breaking the last legal tie that bound him to his country. He had now assembled 100,000 foot and 12,000 horse. The kings of Mauretania, of Commagene, Paphlagonia, and Cilicia followed his banners. His fleet counted 500 large warships, some of them with 8 or even 10 banks of oars. The forces of Octavius were somewhat inferior by land. His vessels were much fewer in number, but of a lighter and more manageable class. Antonius adopted Patrae and the Peloponnesus for his winter quarters, while he disposed of his vast armies for their better support along the coast of Epirus. But his navy suffered from sickness, and Agrippa contrived to throw the Caesarian forces across the Adriatic. From that moment defection commenced. Domitius was the first to abscond. Many princes of Asia followed his example. Antonius fancied himself surrounded by traitors. He distrusted even Cleopatra, and required her to taste in his company all the viands that were set before him. Some partial engagements first took place at sea, in which Agrippa's skill gained the advantage. Antonius was quickly discouraged. He would have withdrawn his land forces further into the interior, but Cleopatra, fearing for her own retreat, dissuaded him from this project. A strange story is related that he sent Octavius a challenge to single combat, which was scornfully rejected. Thereupon he made preparations for flight, and determined to lead a general attack on the Caesarian fleet, with no hope of victory, but merely to gain an opportunity of escape. For several days the agitation of the sea would not allow either armament to move. At last, on September 2nd, the wind fell, the waters became smoother, and with the rise of a gentle breeze the Antonian galleys made for the open sea. Their huge hulks were ill adapted for manoeuvring, but they hurled massive stones from their wooden towers, and thrust forth ponderous irons to grapple the unwary assailant. The light triremes of Octavius were, on the other hand, both dexterous and agile. Their well-trained rowers bore up or backed with rapidity, and swept away the banks of the enemy's oars under cover of a shower of arrows. The combat was animated but indecisive. But while the Antonian barges rolled heavily on the water, incapable of attacking their puny assailants, suddenly Cleopatra's galley, moored in the rear, hoisted sail and threaded the maze of combatants, followed by the Egyptian squadron of 60 vessels. Antonius was not unprepared for the signal. He leapt into a boat and hastened after her. The rage and shame of his adherents filled them with despair. Many tore down their turrets and threw them into the sea to lighten their decks for flight. Yet many continued to fight recklessly or blindly. Too lofty to be scaled, too powerful to be run down, their huge vessels were at last destroyed by fire. 300 of them had been captured, few probably escaped. The land forces refused for a time to believe in their leader's ignominy, and might perhaps have still maintained their position, but when their commander Canidius abandoned the camp for the Caesarian quarters, they offered no further resistance. So complete a victory as that of Actium has seldom been so easily gained. The accounts we have received of the conduct of the miserable Antonius come no doubt from the side of the victors, but it is impossible to suppose that he lost so great a fleet and army so utterly, except by his own misconduct. Octavius might now feel himself secure and proceed to establish his triumphant position with full deliberation. He sent Maecenas and Agrippa to Italy, the one to govern the city, the other to control the legions in his absence, while he advanced in person into Greece and thence into Asia, receiving on all sides the greetings of the people and making arrangements for their future government. He returned to Italy in the course of the ensuing winter. Knights and senators, together with multitudes of citizens, came as far as Brundisium to meet him. He listened graciously to the complaints of his veterans, sold his own effects and those of his nearest friends to satisfy them, planted new colonies in the lands of conquered cities, and finally promised an ample donative from the anticipated spoil of Egypt. With the beginning of spring, B.C. 30, he was again in a condition to follow the track of the fugitives. To them, 6 months' respite had been granted. We can hardly suppose that the court of Alexandria, even though swayed by the vigorous arms of a great Roman imperator, could present any effective resistance to the whole power of Rome if once brought to bear against it. Yet Egypt abounded in wealth. She was the emporium of the immense trade which converged thither from both the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. She was one of the principal granaries of Rome and Italy. Though her native population was feeble and unwarlike, she could purchase the swords of the mercenary soldiers who swarmed on every side. Her rulers were skilled in statecraft, and could intrigue at least with all the discontented rulers and peoples to whom their enforced submission to the great republic was ever odious. We cannot but think that chiefs of real spirit and resolution might have defended themselves under such circumstances against any power that could be arrayed against them. But it was not so. Antonius and Cleopatra traversed the sea in the same vessel. The Roman landed at Paraetonium to secure the small garrison of the place. The Egyptian entered the port of Alexandria with laurels displayed on her deck for fear of the tumult which the sudden news of her disaster might awaken. There was neither love nor obedience awaiting her in her own capital. Her power rested on no popular foundation, and of this she, as the descendant of a long line of foreign potentates, was no doubt well aware. Antonius himself was repulsed by a handful of Roman soldiers. The only relief for the despair which he began to entertain might be derived from the devotion, fruitless though it was, of a small band of gladiators who made their way through Asia and Syria to join him, and only yielded to Herod, king of Judea, on the false assurance of their patron's death. Then it was that Cleopatra proposed to flee into Arabia, but her vessels were destroyed by the wild inhabitants of the Red Sea coast. Again the wretched pair contemplated an attempt to escape into Spain. Any quarter of the world seemed to them in their cowardly distress securer than their own dominion. When this scheme too was relinquished, Antonius shut himself up in a solitary tower. Cleopatra made show at least of greater resolution, and presented herself to the people in military costume, as if to animate them to resistance. But in private she abandoned herself, together with her lover, who had crept back to her embraces, to her accustomed orgies, while she made experiments with various kinds of poison, and ascertained, it was said, that the most painless of deaths is that which follows on the bite of the asp. The two helpless associates were not even true to one another. Each began to negotiate separately with the victor. To Antonius no answer was vouchsafed. Better hopes were held out to Cleopatra if she would turn against her paramour. Octavius, ever cautious, even when the game was in his hands, and anxious to secure her person to embellish his future triumphs, continued to amuse and deceive her. He allowed his agents to remind her of his youth and of her own well-tried fascinations. When Antonius gained a trifling but useless advantage over the first battalion which the enemy threw on his shore, she deemed the time come to separate her interests from his, and treacherously induced his ships to abandon him. At the same moment, and perhaps through the same treachery, the last of his cohorts deserted him. The queen had shut herself up in a tower constructed for her mausoleum. Fearing the violence of the man she had ruined, she caused him to be assured that she had killed herself. With the infatuated renegade all was now over, and he determined himself to die. With the aid of his freedman Eros, he gave himself a mortal wound, But while yet living, he learnt that she too still survived, and causing himself thereupon to be brought to the foot of her tower, he was drawn up to her by her women, and there expired in her arms. Octavius at the same moment entered Alexandria. He charged an officer to secure the queen alive. Cleopatra refused him admittance. When he scaled her chamber, she pretended to stab herself. He seized her arm and assured her of his master's kindness. At length she suffered herself to be removed to the palace, and there awaited an interview with the conqueror. Prepared to exert all her charms upon him, with the bust of Caesar presented to his view. But the attempted seduction proved fruitless, as might have been expected. Octavius kept indeed his eyes on the ground, but he never lost his coolness and self-possession. While she was flattering and caressing him, he coldly demanded a list of her treasures, which he required to be surrendered. But for herself he bade her be of good courage and trust to his magnanimity. Cleopatra was soon made to understand that though her life should be spared, she would be removed to Rome and exhibited in the conqueror's triumph. She resolved to die. Retiring to the mausoleum where lay the body of Antonius, she crowned his bier with flowers, and was found the next morning dead on her couch, her 2 women weeping beside her. "Is this well?" exclaimed the dismayed emissary of Octavius. "It is well," replied Charmian, "and worthy of the daughter of kings." The manner of her death was never certainly known. At the triumph, thus deprived of the ornament of her living presence, her image was carried on a bier, the arms encircled by 2 serpents, which served to confirm the rumour that she had perished by the bite of an asp, brought to her, as was reported, in a basket of figs. The child of the foreign woman by Julius Caesar was cruelly put to death, to appease the exaggerated or pretended sentiments of Roman nationality, while the offspring of Antonius and the matron Fulvia was suffered to survive and retain his birthright as a citizen. The dynasty of the Ptolemies ceased to reign. The Macedonian conquest was replaced by the Roman, and Egypt was finally reduced to the condition of a province. Octavius was master of the Commonwealth and became the founder of an empire. Between these 2 results there is a great difference to be noted. Marius and Pompeius had both been virtually masters of the Commonwealth before Octavius. Sulla and Caesar had been so actually, and had been confirmed as such by legal appointment. The first triumvirate had dominated over it, the second had extorted from its supreme authority, and had demanded a renewal of its powers as long as its members could keep on terms of alliance one with another. The Commonwealth had fallen under a succession of masters, and if from time to time it recovered a momentary independence, it was only by a fitful struggle, which showed its own intrinsic weakness and inability to rule itself. Rome might have fallen again and again into the hands of other masters, each wresting the sovereignty from his predecessor by force, and each yielding it in turn to a stronger successor. The body politic might have been torn in pieces, and either have been split into a number of states or perished in anarchy altogether. The barbarians of the Rhine and the Danube might have arrived 3 centuries before their time. But it was not to be so. Octavius founded an empire. Every age may produce many men who can destroy an empire, but rarely is the man born who can found one. It was the singular fortune of Rome, rather let us say it was the special providence which presides over all human history, that presented mankind at this most critical epoch of their career with the individual man who could actually perform the work required for the maintenance of the ancient civilization. In the overthrow of the so-called Roman liberty there is doubtless something to regret, but surely not much, for Roman liberty was little else than general servitude. In the violence and selfishness by which this overthrow is effected, there is much which the moralist may be called upon to denounce, though in view of the vastness of the issue involved, the historian will hardly pause to weigh nicely in the balance the crimes of one or other of the actors in the shifting scenes before him. The defects and sins of the empire which followed may be estimated by those who undertake specially to describe it. But the moral to be drawn from the epoch before us is simply this, that Rome had reached the moment when she could no longer retain her political liberty, and that the struggles of her triumvirates could only end either in anarchy or in monarchy. End of section 24. Read by Pamela Nagami in Encino, California, September 2021. End of The Roman Triumvirates by Charles Merivale. Section 2 of Roman History, The Early Empire by William Wolfe Capes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 1, Augustus, BC 31 to AD 14, Part 1. The victory of Actium had made Octavianus the undisputed master of the Roman world. One by one, rivals and obstacles had been swept away, and the patient schemer had now mounted to the topmost rung of the ladder of ambition. During the troublous years of the long struggle for power, his public life had been one course of selfish aims, unscrupulous acts, and makeshift policy. He had yet to prove that there was anything of real and abiding greatness in his schemes to raise him from the ranks of mere political adventurers. But from this time we may trace a seeming change of character, which is the more remarkable because it is so hard to parallel. It was no change of measures only, such as often comes with new conditions, such as that which made the founder of the dynasty reverse much of the policy of the earlier years. For spendthrift and prodigal as Julius had been before, he used his power to curtail extravagance, sent police agents to the markets and even to the houses of the wealthy to put down luxury by force. The leader of the popular party forbade the growth of guilds and social clubs like those which had often carried the elections in his favor. The favorite of the populace was anxious to check the spread of pauperism by sterner measures. The revolutionary general, whose tent had been the refuge of the men of tarnished name and ruined fortunes, baffled all their hopes of plunder by passing stringent measures to restore credit and to curb official greed. Octavianus also, in like case, resorted to like policy. One of his first cares was to repeal the unconstitutional acts of his earlier life, and so to close the period of revolution. He took steps without delay to restore order and to strengthen the moral safeguards which years of anarchy and civil war had almost ruined. To this end he passed laws like those of Julius, and unlike his kinsman, was enabled by his long tenure of power to carry out a conservative reform in morals and religion, which left some enduring traces. But the change in character lay deeper far than this. He had shown, while the struggle lasted, a cruelty without excuse. Though possibly reluctant at the first to engage in proscriptions, he is said to have acted in them more relentlessly than either of his colleagues. He had his prisoners of war butchered in cold blood, mocked at their prayers for decent burial, and calmly watched their dying agonies. That he was hard and pitiless beyond the spirit of his times is implied in many stories of the day, and among others we read that when the captives of Philippi passed in bonds before their conquerors, they saluted Antonius with marked respect, but vented their deepest curses on Octavianus to his face. But after Actium, he showed what was for that age an unusual clemency. He spared his open enemies, he hunted out no victims, and professed even to burn the secret papers of his rival which might have compromised his partisans at Rome. The same gentler spirit breathes through the whole of his long period of rule. His jealous intolerance had led him once to drive a consul elect to suicide for a bitter word, and to fine or banish citizens of Nursia for honoring with a monument their dead who had fallen, as they wrote, in defense of freedom on the field of Mutina. But he was ready now to show respect to the memory of Pompeius, to let historians write the praises of the great republicans of Rome, to congratulate the men of Mediolanum, Milan, for prizing the busts of Brutus, to listen calmly to the jibes vented on himself in popular satires or in dead men's wills, to let even lampoons be scattered in the Senate house, and make no effort to hunt down the authors. His suspicious fears had made him once give orders for the instant execution of a curious bystander who had pressed in too eagerly to hear him speak in public, and put even to the torture a praetor who came to greet him, and whose hidden notebook was mistaken for a dagger. But in later life he walked without an escort through the streets, went to and fro to join the social gatherings of his friends, and showed no fear of an assassin's knife. The cheerful cordiality and homely courtesies of his maturer age were a marked contrast to the cold, ungenial reserve of earlier days, and those who find his real character hard to read may see perhaps a fitting symbol for it in the figure of the Sphinx which he wore upon his signet ring. But this change of manner could not be an easy thing, and was probably not soon effected. There are signs which seem to show that constant watchfulness and self-restraint was needed to curb his natural temper, and that personal influences were at work to help him. Though he was patient and merciful in most cases that were brought before him when on the seat of judgment, it is said that Maecenas, who was standing by, marked on one occasion the old bloodthirsty instinct reappear, and flung to him a hasty note with the words "Rise, hangman," written on it. Another time, when stung by what was uttered in the Senate, he hurried out abruptly, and excused himself afterwards for want of courtesy, by saying that he feared his anger would slip from his control. We are told that with others commonly, and even with Livia his wife, he would not always trust himself to speak on subjects of grave moment without writing down the notes of what he had to say. In the gloom that settled on him in old age, when family losses and dishonour, coupled with national disasters, weighed upon his mind, the hard and unlovely features of his character, long hidden out of sight, seemed to come to light once more, as the force of self-control was weakened by the laws of natural decay. Yet even with such reserves, his history presents a spectacle almost unexampled of the force of will in moulding and tempering an ungenial nature, and of the chastening influence of sovereign rule. The signal victory just won, the honours voted by the servile Senate, the acclamations of the people, the license of unbounded power, might well have turned his head, as they proved fatal to the temper of many a later emperor. But the dagger of Brutus haunted his memory and warned him to beware of outraging Roman feeling. But far beyond its effect upon his personal bearing, we may trace the influence of these warning memories on the work which lay before him of giving shape and system to the future government of Rome. Power and repute had passed away from the old forms of the Republic. The whole world lay at the feet of the master of many legions. It remained only to define the constitutional forms in which the new forces were to work. But to do this was no easy task. The perplexities of his position, the fears and hopes that crossed his mind, are thrown into dramatic form by the historian Dion Cassius, who brings a scene before our fancy in which Octavianus listens to the conflicting counsels of his two great advisers, Agrippa and Maecenas. The former is supposed to paint in sombre colours the difficulties of a monarch's lot, to remind him of the warnings of the past and the dangers of the future, and strongly to urge him to copy the example set by Sulla, and after passing needful laws and strengthening the safeguards against anarchy and license, to resign the outward show of power and come down from the dizzy pinnacle of greatness. Maecenas, on the other hand, counsels absolute rule, though masked by constitutional disguises, and describes at great length a system of centralized government in sketching which the historian drew mainly from the experience of his own later times, and with slight regard for strict historic truth, attributed to the inventive genius of Maecenas a full-grown system of political machinery which it took some centuries of imperialism to develop. But though we must regard the narrative in question more as the writer's own political theorizing than as a sketch of matter of fact, yet there is little doubt that schemes of resignation were at some time discussed by the emperor and by his circle of advisers. It is even possible, as the same writer tells us, that he laid before the senators at this time some proposal to leave the helm of state and to let them guide it as of old. We are told that they were thrown into confusion by his words, and that, mistrusting his sincerity, or fearing the return of anarchy and the scramble for power that would soon ensue, they all implored him to withdraw his words and take back the power which he had resigned. The scene, if ever really acted, was but an idle comedy, and the offer could scarcely have been seriously meant, though there may have been some passing thought of it even at this time, and still more at a later period, when he had long been sated with power and burdened with the cares of office. It is more probable that he was content with some faint show of resistance, when the Senate heaped their honours on his head, as afterwards, when more than once, after a 10 years' interval, they solemnly renewed the tenure of his power. But we cannot doubt his sincerity in one respect, in his wish to avoid the kingly title and all the odious associations of the name. It had been from early times offensive to Roman ears. It had grown far more so as they heard more of the wanton lust and cruelty and haughtiness of Eastern monarchs, and they scorned to be degraded themselves to the level of their cringing subjects. The charge of aspiring to be king had often been an ominous cry in party struggles, and had proved fatal to more than one great leader. It had been truly said, perhaps, of Caesar, and had largely helped to ruin him, and his successor was too wary to be dazzled by the bauble of a name. He shrank also from another title, truly Roman in its character, but odious since the days of Sulla. And though the populace of Rome, when panic-struck by pestilence and famine, clamoured to have him made dictator, and threatened to burn the Senate as it sat in council if their will was not obeyed, yet nothing would induce him to bear the hateful name. But the name of Caesar he had taken long ago, after his illustrious uncle's death, and this became the title first of the dynasty and then of the imperial office. Besides this, he allowed himself to be styled Augustus, a name which roused no jealousy and outraged no Roman sentiment, yet vaguely implied some dignity and reverence from its long association with the objects of religion. As such, he preferred it to the suggested name of Romulus, and allowed one of the months to be so called after him, as the preceding one of Julius had been named after his kinsman. With this exception, he assumed no new symbol of monarchic power, but was satisfied with the old official titles, which, though charged with memories of the Republic, yet singly corresponded to some side or fragment of absolute authority. The first of these was Imperator, which served to connect him with the army. The imperium, which the name expressed, had stood in earlier days for the higher functions, more especially for the power of the sword, which belonged to civil as well as military authority. But gradually curtailed in other cases by the jealousy of the Republic, it had kept its full meaning only in the camp. The Imperator was the general in command, or in a still more special case, he was the victorious leader whose soldiers had saluted him upon the field of battle. Julius, whose veterans had often greeted him with this title in many a hard-fought campaign, chose it seemingly as a fitting symbol of the new regime, as a frank avowal of its military basis, and in this sense it was found convenient by his successors. It implied absolute authority, such as the general has over his soldiers, and the concentration in a single chief of the widespread powers entrusted to subordinate commanders. It suggested little of the old forms of constitutional election, but appealed rather to the memory of the army's loyal acclamations and gave a seeming claim to their entire obedience. The title of the tribunician power connected the monarch with the interests of the lower orders. In the early days of privilege, when Rome was parted into rival classes, the tribunes had been the champions of the commons. Sacrosanct or inviolate themselves, and armed with power to shield the weak from the license of the magistrate or noble, they gradually assumed the right to put a veto or check on all public business in Rome. In the party struggles of the last century of the Republic, they had abused their constitutional powers to destroy the influence of the Senate and organize the popular movement against the narrow oligarchy of the ruling classes. Such authority was too important to be overlooked or entrusted in its fullness into other hands. The emperor did not indeed assume the tribunate, but was vested with the tribunician power, which overshadowed the annual holders of the office. It made his person sacred, not in the city only, or in discharge of official acts, as in their case, but in all times and through the whole breadth of the empire. It gave him the formal right to call the meetings of the Senate and to lay before them such business as he pleased, and thus secured the initiative in all concerns of state. Out of the old privilege of appeal to the protection of a tribune came the right of acquittal in judicial functions, which made the emperor a high court of appeal from all the lower courts, and out of which seemingly has grown the right of pardon vested in the kings of modern Europe. The full meaning and extension of the title seems not to have been discerned at once, but once grasped, it was too important to be dropped. By it succeeding emperors dated the tenure of their power, as by the years of a king's reign, and the formal act by which the title was conferred on the kinsman or the confidant who stood nearest to the throne seemed to point him out for succession to the imperial rank. The familiar name of prince was one of dignity rather than of power. The princeps senatus in old days had been the foremost senator of his time, distinguished by weight of character and the experience of high rank, early consulted in debate, and carrying decisive influence by his vote. No one but the emperor could fill this position safely, and he assumed the name henceforth to connect him with the Senate, as other titles seemed to bind him to the army and the people. For the post of supreme pontiff, Augustus was content to wait a while, until it passed by death from the feeble hands of Lepidus. He then claimed the exclusive tenure of the office, and after this time Pontifex Maximus was always added to the long list of imperial titles. It put into his hands, as the highest functionary of religion, the control of all the ritual of the state. It was a convenient instrument for his policy of conservative reform, and associated with his name some of the reverence that gathered round the domain of spiritual life. Besides these titles, to which he assumed an exclusive right, he also filled occasionally and for short periods some of the republican offices of higher rank, both in the capital and in the country towns. He took from time to time the consular power, with its august traditions and imposing ceremonial. The authority of censor lay ready to his hands when a moral reform was to be set on foot, and a return attempted to the severity of ancient manners, or when the Senate was to be purged of unworthy members, and the order of the equites or knights to be reviewed and its dignity consulted. Beyond the capital, the proconsular power was vested in him, without local limitations, and gave him the right to issue his instructions to the commanders of the legions, as the great generals of the Republic had done before. Finally, he deigned often to accept offices of local dignity in the smaller towns throughout the empire, appointing in each case a deputy to discharge the duties of the post. The offices of state at Rome, meanwhile, lasted on from the Republic to the empire, unchanged in name and with little seeming change of functions. Consuls, praetors, quaestors, tribunes, and aediles rose from the same classes as before, and moved for the most part in the same round of work, though they had lost forever their power of initiative and real control. Elected by the people formerly, but with much sinister influence of bribery and auguries, They were now mainly the nominees of Caesar, though the forms of popular election were still for a time observed, and though Augustus condescended to canvass in person for his friends and to send letters of commendation for those whom he wished to have elected. The consulship was entirely reserved for his nominees, but passed rapidly from hand to hand, since in order to gratify a larger number, it was granted at varying intervals for a few months only. For though it was in fact a political nullity henceforth, and its value lay mainly in the evidence of imperial favour or its prospects of provincial office, yet the old dignity lasted still, and for centuries the post was spoken of by Romans as almost the highest prize of their ambition. For lower posts, a distinction was observed between the places, generally less than half, reserved entirely for the emperor to fill with his candidati Caesaris, as they are called in their inscriptions, and those that were left for some show of open voting, though influenced, it might be, by court favour. The peculiar feature of the old Roman executive had been its want of centralized action. Each magistrate might thwart and check his colleague. The collision between different officials, the power of veto, and the absence of supreme authority might bring the political machinery to a deadlock. The imperial system swept aside these dangers, left each magistrate to the routine of his own work, and made him feel his responsibility to the central chief. It was part of the policy of Augustus to disturb as little as possible the old names and forms of the Republic, to leave their show and dignity, that those who filled them might seem to be not his own creatures, but the servants of the state. But besides these, he set up a number of new offices, often of more real power, though of lower rank. He filled the most important of them with his confidants, delegating to them the functions which most needed his control, and in which he could not brook any show of independence, and left behind him the rudiments of a centralized bureaucracy, which his successors gradually enlarged. Two terms correspond respectively to two great classes. The name praefectus, the préfet of modern France, stood in earlier days for the deputy of any officer of state charged especially to execute some definite work. The praefects of Caesar were his servants, named by him and responsible to him, set to discharge duties which the old constitution had commonly ignored. The prefect of the city, praefectus urbi, had appeared in shadowy form under the Republic to represent the consul in his absence. Augustus felt the need, when called away from Rome, to have someone there whom he could trust to watch the jealous nobles and control the fickle mob. His trustiest confidants, Maecenas and Agrippa, filled the post, and it became a standing office with a growing sphere of competence, overtopping the magistracies of earlier date. The praefects of the praetorian cohorts first appeared when the Senate formally assigned a bodyguard to Augustus later in his reign. The troops were named after the picked soldiers who were quartered round the tents of the generals of the Republic, and when they were concentrated by the city walls, their chief commanders soon filled a formidable place in history, and their loyalty or treachery often decided the fate of Rome. Next to these in power and importance came the praefects of the watch, the new police force organized by Augustus as a protection against the dangers of the night and of the corn supplies of Rome, which were always an object of especial care on the part of the imperial government. And besides these, there were many various duties entrusted by the head of the state to special delegates, both in the capital and through the provinces. The title procurator, which has come down to us in the form of proctor, was at first mainly a term of civil law, and was used for a financial agent or attorney. The officers so called were regarded at the first as stewards of the emperor's property or managers of his private business. They were therefore for some time of humble origin, for the emperor's household was organized like that of any Roman noble. Slaves or freedmen filled the offices of trust, wrote his letters, kept his books, managed his affairs, and did the work of the treasurers and secretaries of state of later days. Kept within bounds by sterner masters, they abused the confidence of weak emperors, and outraged Roman pride by their wealth, arrogance, and ostentation. The agents of the emperor's privy purse throughout the provinces were called by the same title, but were commonly of higher rank and more repute. Such, in its bare outline, was the executive of the imperial government. We have next to see what was the position of the Senate. That body had been in early times the council summoned to advise the king or consul. By the weight and experience of its members and their lifelong tenure of office, it soon towered above the short-lived executive and became the chief moving force at Rome. But the policy of the Gracchi had dealt a fatal blow at its supremacy. Proscriptions and civil wars had thinned its ranks. The first Caesar had treated it with studied disrespect, and in the subsequent times of anarchy the influence of the order and the reputation of its members had sunk to the lowest depth of degradation. It was one of the first cares of Augustus to restore its credit. At the risk of odium and personal danger, he more than once revised the list and purged it of unworthy members, summoning eminent provincials in their place. He was careful of their outward dignity, and made the capital of 1,000,000 sesterces a needful condition of the rank. The functions also of the Senate were in theory enlarged. Its decrees on questions brought before it had henceforth the binding force of law. As the popular assembly ceased to meet for legislation, case after case was submitted to its judgment, till it gained speedily by prescription a jurisdiction of wide range, and before long it decided the elections at its will, or registered the nominations of the emperor. But the substance of power and independence had passed away from it for ever. Matters of great moment were debated first, not in the Senate house, but in a sort of privy council formed by the trusted advisers of the emperor, while the discussions of the larger body served chiefly to mask the forms of absolutism, to feel the pulse of popular sentiment, and to register decisions formed elsewhere. Treated with respect and courtesy by wary princes, the senators were the special mark of the jealousy and greed of the worst rulers. End of section 2. Section 3 of Roman History, The Early Empire by William Wolfe Capes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 1. Augustus, BC 31 to AD 14, Part 2. If we now turn our thoughts from the center to the provinces, we shall find that the imperial system brought with it more sweeping changes and more real improvement. Almost every country of the Roman world had long been frightfully misgoverned. Toward the end of the Republic there rises from every land a cry in tones that grow ever louder, a cry of misery and despair, that their governors are greedy and corrupt, scandalously indifferent to injustice, conniving at the extortion of the Roman capitalists who farmed the tithes and taxes, and of the moneylenders who had settled like leeches all around them. The governors who hastened to their provinces after a short tenure of official rank at Rome looked to the emoluments of office to retrieve their fortunes, exhausted frequently by public shows and bribery at home. They abused their power in 100 ways to amass enormous wealth, with little check from the public opinion of their order, or from the courts of law before which they might possibly be prosecuted by their victims or their rivals. But a new order of things was now begun. Augustus left to the Senate the nominal control of the more peaceful provinces, which needed little military force. To these ex-consuls and ex-praetors were sent out as before, but with no power of the sword and little of the purse. High salaries were paid to them directly by the state, but the sources of indirect gains were gradually cut off. By their side was a proctor of the emperor's privy purse to watch their conduct and report their misdemeanors. At home there was a vigilant ruler ready to give ear to the complaints of the provincials and to see that justice was promptly done by the tribunals or the Senate. Doubtless we still hear of much misgovernment, and scandalous abuses sometimes are detailed, for the evils to be checked had been the growth of ages, and the vigilance of a single ruler, however strict, must have been oftentimes at fault. The remaining countries, called imperial provinces, were ruled by generals called legati, or in some few cases by proctors only. They held office during the good pleasure of their master, and for longer periods often than the senatorial governors. There are signs that the imperial provinces were better governed, and that the transference of a country to this class from the other was looked upon as a real boon, and not as an empty honour. Such in its chief features was the system of Augustus, the rudiments of the bureaucratic system which was slowly organized by later ages. This was his constructive policy, and on the value of this creative work his claims to greatness must be based. To the provinces the gain undoubtedly was great. His rule brought them peace and order and the essentials of good government. It left the local forms of self-rule almost untouched, and lightened, if it did not quite remove, the incubus of oppression which had so long tightened its grasp upon their throats. At Rome, too, the feeling of relief was keenly felt. Credit recovered with a rebound after the victory at Actium. Prices and the rate of interest fell at once. The secret adherents of the fallen cause began to breathe again more freely when they heard no mention of proscription. The friends of order learnt with joy that the era of anarchy was closed. Rigid republicans found their jealous suspicions half disarmed by the respect shown for the ancient forms and names, by the courtesy with which the Senate had been treated, and above all, perhaps, by the modest, unassuming manners of their prince. For he shunned carefully all outward pomp, moved about the streets almost unattended, sat patiently through the games and shows which the Romans passionately loved, went out to dinner readily when asked, and charmed men by his simple courtesy. He could bear plain speaking too, for a blunt soldier to whose petition he said that he had been too busy to attend, told him to his face that he had never said he was too busy to expose his own life for him in battle. The expenses of his household scarcely rose to the level of those of many a wealthy noble. He wore no clothes save those made for him by Livia and her women, and studiously avoided all profusion or extravagance. He tried also to spare his people's purses, for upon a journey he often passed through a town by night, to give the citizens no chance of proving their loyalty by costly outlay. But he spent his treasure lavishly for public ends. The public games and festivals provided by him were on a scale of magnificence quite unexampled. Great sums were often spent in largesse to the populace of Rome. In times of scarcity, corn was sold in the capital below cost price, besides the vast quantities distributed in free doles among the poor. Noble senators of decayed fortunes were often pensioned to enable them to live up to their rank. Costly buildings, set apart for public uses, temples, baths, theatres, and aqueducts, rose rapidly on every side. His kinsmen, intimates, all whom his influence could move, vied with him in such outlay, and helped him to realize the boast of later days that he found a city of brick and left one of marble in its place. The great roads in Italy and through the provinces were carefully repaired, and a postal system set on foot, confined, it is true, to official uses. Armed patrols marched along the roads, brigandage was forcibly put down, slave gangs were inspected, and the abuses of times of violence redressed. In the capital itself a police force was organized for the first time, intended mainly at first for protection against fire, but soon extended and made permanent to secure peace and order in the streets, which for centuries the Republic had neglected. In distant countries, his fatherly care was shown in time of need by liberal grants of money to help public works or repair the ravages of earthquakes. The interests of the legions also were consulted, but not at the expense of quiet citizens as before. Vast sums were spent in buying up lands in the neighbourhood of the great towns of Italy, where war or slow decay had thinned their numbers, in order at once to recruit the urban population and supply the veterans with farms. Colonies were planted too beyond the seas for the relief of the overgrown populace of Rome. There was enough in such material boons to conciliate all classes through the empire. The stiff-necked champions of the Republic had died upon the battlefield. A generation had grown up demoralized by years of anarchy, and few were left to mourn the loss of freedom. Few eyes could see what was one day to be apparent, that the disguises and the insincerities of the new regime were full of danger, that to senator and office-bearer the paths of politics were strewn with snares, that in the face of a timid or suspicious ruler it would be as perilous to show their fear as to make a brave show of independence. For a while they heard the familiar sounds of senate, consul, and of tribune. They saw the same pageants as of old in daily life. Nor did they realize as yet that liberty was gone forever, and that the ancient forms that passed before them were as empty of real life as the ancestral masks that moved along the streets to the noble Roman's funeral pyre. From the imperial machinery we may next turn to the great men who helped possibly to create and certainly to work it. It was the singular good fortune of Augustus to secure the services of two ministers like Agrippa and Maecenas, of different genius but equal loyalty of character. Marcus Vipsanius, surnamed Agrippa, had been in early days the schoolmate and intimate of Octavius. They were at Apollonia together, studying the philosophy and art of Greece, when the tidings came that Caesar had been murdered. They were together when the bold scheme was formed, and the two youths set forth together to claim the heritage of Caesar and to strive for the empire of the world. To whom the initiative was due we know not, but we do know that Agrippa's courage never wavered, though Octavianus seemed at times ready to falter and draw back. To the many-sided activity of Agrippa and to his unfailing resolution, the success of that enterprise seems mainly due. He was the great general of the cause that triumphed, the hero of every forlorn hope, and the knight-errant for every hazardous adventure in distant regions. His energy helped to win Perugia after stubborn siege. His quick eyes saw on the Lucrine lake the shelter for the fleets that were to be manned and trained before they could hope to face Sextus Pompeius, the bold corsair chief who swept the seas and menaced Rome with famine. Thanks to him again, the victory of Actium was won, for the genius, if not the courage, of Octavianus failed him on the scene of battle. Whenever danger showed itself henceforth, in Gaul and Spain, where the native tribes rose once more in arms, in Pontus, where one of the line of Mithridates unfurled the banner of revolt, on the shores of the Danube, where the Pannonians were stirring, no hand but Agrippa's could be trusted to dispel the gathering storms. We find in him not heroism alone, but the spirit of self-sacrifice. 3 times we read he refused the honours of a triumph. At a word he stooped to the lowest round of official rank, the aedileship, burdened as it was with the ruinous responsibilities of shows and festivals, and kept the Romans in good humour at a critical moment of the civil struggle. To win further popularity by the sweets of material well-being, the soldier forsook the camp and courted the arts of peace, busied himself with sanitary reforms, repaired the magnificent cloacae of old Rome, constructed the splendid thermae for the hot baths introduced from eastern lands, built new aqueducts, towering aloft upon the arches of the old, and distributed the pure water so conveyed to fountains in every quarter of the city, which were decorated with statues and columns of precious marbles to be counted by the hundred. Another sacrifice was called for, to divorce the daughter of Atticus, Cicero's famous friend, and draw nearer the throne by marrying the emperor's niece Marcella, and he obeyed from dutiful submission to his master, or from the ambitious hope to share the power which his sword had won. Soon it seemed as if his loyalty was to meet with its reward. Augustus was brought to death's door by sudden illness, and in what seemed like his last hour seized Agrippa's hand and slipped a ring upon the finger, as if to mark him out for his successor. But health returned again, and with it visible coolness toward Agrippa, and increased affection for Marcellus, his young nephew. Agrippa resigned himself without a murmur, and lived in retirement a while at Lesbos, till the death of Marcellus and the warnings of Maecenas pointed him out again as the only successor worthy of the empire. Signs of discontent among the populace of Rome quickened the emperor's desire to have his trusty friend beside him, and to draw him yet more closely to him, he bade him put away Marcella, and gave him his own daughter Julia. Once more he obeyed in silence, and now might fairly hope to be rewarded for his patience, and one day to mount into the weakly emperor's place. But his lot was to be always second, never first. His strong frame, slowly weakened by hard campaigns and ceaseless journeys at full speed in every quarter of the world, gave way at last in 12 B.C., and his career was closed while he seemed yet in his prime. In him Augustus lost a gallant soldier and unselfish friend, who is said indeed to have advised him after Actium to resign his power, but who certainly had done more than any other to set him up and to keep him on the pinnacle of greatness. It throws a curious light upon his story to read the comment on it in the pages of the naturalist Pliny. He is speaking of the superstitious fancy that misery clouded the lives of all who were called Agrippa. In spite, he says, of his brilliant exploits, he was no exception to the rule. He was unlucky in his wife Julia, who dishonoured his good name, in his children, who died by poison or in exile, and unhappy also in bearing all his life what he calls the hard bondage of Augustus. The friend for whom he toiled so long and faithfully showed little tenderness of heart. The master whom he served had tasked his energies in every sphere, and called for many an act of self-devotion, but he had already looked coldly on his loyal minister, and he might at any moment weary of a debt he could not pay, and add another page to the long chronicle of the ingratitude of princes. Maecenas, better known by his mother's name than that of Cilnius his father, came from an Etruscan stock that had given a line of masters to Arretium. He was better fitted for the council chamber than the field of battle, for the delicate manoeuvres of diplomacy than for the rough work of stormy times. During the years of civic struggle, and while the air was charged with thunderclouds, we find him always as the trusty agent of Octavianus, engaged on every important mission that needed adroitness and address. His subtle tact and courtesies were tried with the same success upon Sextus Pompeius and on Antonius, when the confidence of each was to be won, or angry feelings charmed away, or the dangers of a coalition met. His honeyed words were found of not less avail with the populace of Rome, when scarcity and danger threatened, and the masters of the legions were away. It seemed indeed, after the empire was once established, that his political career was closed, for he professed no high ambition, refused to wear the gilded chains of office, or to rise above the modest rank of knighthood. He seemed content with his great wealth, how gained we need not ask, with the social charms of literary circles and the refinements of luxurious ease of which the Etruscans were proverbially fond. But his influence, though secret, was as potent as before. He was still the emperor's chief adviser, counselling tact and moderation, ready to soothe his ruffled nerves when sick and weary with the cares of state. He was still serving on a secret mission, and one that lasted all his life. Keenly relishing the sweets of peace, and all the refined and social pleasures which a great capital alone can furnish, haunted by no high principles to vex his sybaritic ease, and gifted with a rare facility of winning words, he was peculiarly fitted to influence the tone of Roman circles, and diffuse a grateful pride in the material blessings of imperial rule. He could sympathize with the weariness of men who had passed through long years of civic strife, and seen every cause betrayed by turns, and who craved only peace and quiet, with leisure to enjoy and to forget. Instinct or policy soon led him to caress the rising poets of the day, for their social influence might be great. Their epigrams soon passed from mouth to mouth. A well-turned phrase or a bold satire lingered in the memory long after the sound of the verses died away, and the practice of public recitations gave them at times something of the power to catch the public ear which journalism has had in later days. So, from taste and policy alike, Maecenas played the part of patron of the arts and letters. He used the fine point and wit of Horace to sing the praises of the enlightened ruler who gave peace and plenty to the world, to scoff meantime at high ambitions and play with the memory of fallen causes. The social philosophy of moderation soothed the self-respect of men who were sated with the fierce game of politics and war, and gladly saw their indolent and sceptical refinement reflected in the poet's graceful words. He used the nobler muse of Virgil to lead the fancy of the Romans back to the good old days, ere country life was deserted for the camp and city, suggesting the subject of the Georgics to revive the old taste for husbandry and lead men to break up the wasteland with the plough. He helped also to degrade that muse by leading it astray from worthier themes, to waste its melody and pathos in the uncongenial attempt to throw a halo of heroic legend round the cradle of the Julian line. Other poets, too, Propertius, Tibullus, Ovid, paid dearly for the patronage which cramped their genius and befouled their taste, and in place of truer inspiration prompted chiefly amorous insipidities and servile adulation. For himself, his chief aim in later life seemed careless ease, but that boon fled away from him the more he wooed it. The emperor eyed Terentia, his wife, too fondly, and the injured husband consoled himself with the best philosophy he could. But she was a scold as well as a coquette, and now drove him to despair with bitter words, now lured him to her side again, till their quarrels passed at length beyond the house and became the common talk of all the gossips of the town. As he was borne along the streets, lolling in his litter, in a dress loose with studied negligence, his fingers all bedecked with rings, with eunuchs and parasites and jesters in his train, men asked each other with a smile what was the last news of the fickle couple. Were they married or divorced again? At last his nerves gave way and sleep forsook him. In vain he had recourse to the pleasures of the table which his Tuscan nature loved, to the rare wines that might lull his cares to rest, to distant orchestras of soothing music. In earlier days he had set to tuneful verse what Seneca calls the shameful prayer, that his life might still be spared when health and strength and comeliness forsook him. He lived long enough to feel the vanity of all his wishes. Nothing could cure his lingering agony of sleeplessness, or drive the spectre of death from his bedside. But the end came at last. He passed away, and loyal even in his death, he left the emperor his heir. We have watched Augustus in his public life, and marked his measures and his ministers. It is time now to turn to his domestic circle, and see what influences were about him there. The chief figure to be studied is Livia, his wife, who had been the object of his violent love while still married to Tiberius Nero, and had been forced to quit her reluctant husband for the home of the triumvir. She soon gained over him an influence that never wavered. Her gentle courtesies of manner, her wifely virtues never tainted by the breath of scandal, the homeliness with which she copied the grave matrons of old days who stayed at home and spun the wool to clothe their men, the discreet reserve with which she shut her eyes to her husband's infidelities, are the reasons given by herself, as we are told when she was asked for the secret of her power. Quite insufficient in themselves, they may have helped to secure the ascendancy which her beauty and her strength of character had won. The gradual change that may be traced in the outward bearing of Augustus may be due partly to her counsels. Certainly she seemed to press patience and forbearance on him, and Dion Cassius at a later time puts into her mouth a pretty sermon on the grace of mercy, when her husband's temper had been soured by traitorous plots. She was open-handed, too, in works of charity, brought up poor children at her own expense, and gave many a maid a marriage dower. Caligula, who knew her well, and had insight in his own mad way, called her Ulysses in petticoats, and the men of her own day, it seems, thought her such a subtle schemer that they credited her with acts of guile of which no evidence was produced. Dark rumours floated through the streets of Rome, and men spoke of her in meaning whispers, as death knocked again and again at the old man's doors, and the favourites of the people passed away. It was her misfortune or her guilt that all who were nearest to the emperor, all who stood between her son and the succession, died by premature and seemingly mysterious deaths. The young Marcellus, to whose memory Virgil raised the monument of his pathetic lines, the brave Agrippa cut off when all his hopes seemed nearest to fulfilment, 2 of Julia's children by Agrippa, within 18 months of each other, all died in turn before their time, and all were followed to the grave by regrets and by suspicions that grew louder in each case. For Livia had no children by Augustus. Of the fruit of her first marriage, Drusus died in Germany, and Tiberius alone was left. The popular fancy, goaded by repeated losses, found it easy to believe that a ruthless tragedy was going on before their eyes, and that the chief actor was a mother scheming for her son, calmly sweeping from his path every rival that she feared. One grandson still was left, the youngest of Julia's children, Agrippa Posthumus, who was born after his father's death. On him Augustus lavished his love awhile as the last hope of his race, adopted him even as his own, but soon he found, or was led to fancy, that the boy was clownish and intractable, removed him to Surrentum, and when confinement made him worse, to the island of Planasia. But one day pity or regret stole over the old man's heart. He slipped away quietly with a single confidant to see the boy, seemed to feel the old love revive again, and spoke as if he would restore him to his place at home. The one bystander told his wife the story, and she whispered it to Livia's ear. That witness died suddenly soon after, and his wife was heard to moan that her indiscretion caused his death. Then Livia dared no longer to wait, lest the dotard's fondness should be fatal to her hopes. Quietly she took her potent drugs to a favourite fig tree in a garden close at hand, then, as they walked together, later on offered him the poisoned figs, and ate herself of the harmless ones that grew beside. Such were the stories that were current at the time, too lightly credited perhaps from fear or hate, but noteworthy as reflecting the credulous suspicions of the people and the fatality that seemed to haunt the household of the Caesars. Of that family, the 2 Julias yet remained alive, the wife and daughter of Agrippa, but they were pining in their lonely prisons, and their memory had almost passed away. End of section 3. Section 4 of Roman History, The Early Empire by William Wolfe Capes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 1. Augustus, BC 31 to AD 14, Part 3. The elder Julia was the child of Augustus by Scribonia. Betrothed while still in the nursery to a young son of Antonius, she was promised in jest to Cotasan, a chieftain of the Getae, and then to the nephew of the emperor, Marcellus. At his death she passed at the age of 17, and with her the hopes of the succession, to Agrippa's house, where an earlier wife was displaced to make room for her. 11 years she lived with him, and when he died, Tiberius must in his turn divorce the Agrippina whom he loved, and take the widowed princess to his house. She had been brought up strictly, almost sternly, by her father. Profligate as he had been himself in early life, his standard of womanly decorum was a high one, and he wished to see in Julia the austere dignity of the Roman matrons of the old days. But she was readier to follow the examples of his youth than the disguises and hypocrisies of his later life. She scorned the modest homeliness of Livia and the republican simplicity of Augustus, aired ostentatiously her pride of race, and loved profusion and display. Once freed by marriage from the restraints of her father's home, she began a career of license unparalleled even for that age. She flung to the winds all womanly reserves, paraded often in her speech a cynical disdain for conventional restraints, and gathered round her the most reckless of the youth of Rome, till her excesses became a scandal and a byword through the town. The emperor was the last to know of his dishonoured name. He had marked, indeed, with grave displeasure her love of finery and sumptuous living, and had even destroyed a house which she built upon too grand a scale. But for years no one dared to tell him more, till at last someone, perhaps Livia, raised the veil, and the whole story of her life was known. He heard of her long career of guilty license, and how but lately she had roved at night through the city with her train of revellers, and made the Forum the scene of her worst orgies, dishonouring with bold words and shameless deeds the very tribune where her father stood but yesterday to speak in favour of his stricter marriage laws. He was told, though with little show of truth, that she was plotting a still darker deed, and urging her paramour to take his life. The blow fell very hardly on the father, and clouded all the peace of his last years. At first his rage passed quite from his control. Her desks were ransacked, her slaves were tortured, and all the infamous details poured out before the Senate. When he was told that Phoebe, the freedwoman and confidant of Julia, had hung herself in her despair, he answered grimly, "Would that I were Phoebe's father." Nothing but her death seemed likely to content him. Then came a change. He shut himself away from sight, and would speak of her no more. She was exiled to a cheerless island, 2 B.C., and though the fickle people in Tiberias even pleaded for her pardon, she was at most allowed at Rhegium, a less gloomy prison. There, in her despairing loneliness, she must have felt a lingering agony of retribution. She heard how the hand of vengeance fell upon her friends and paramours, and harder still to bear, how child after child mysteriously died, and only 2 were left, Agrippa, thrust away from sight and pity on his petty island, and Julia, who had followed in her mother's steps and was an exile and a prisoner like herself. Such family losses and dishonours might well embitter the emperor's last years, but other causes helped to deepen the gloom which fell upon him. Since Agrippa's death, there was no general whom he could trust to lead his armies, no strong hand to curb the restless tribes of the half-conquered north, or roll back from the frontiers the tide of war. He sent his grandsons to the distant armies, but they were young and inexperienced, and firmer hands than theirs were needed to save the eagles from disgrace. One great disaster at this time revealed the danger and sent a thrill of horror through the empire. The German tribes upon the Gallic border had kept unbroken peace of late, and many of them seemed quite to have submitted to the Roman rule. A few years before, indeed, some hordes had dashed across the Rhine upon a plundering foray, and in the course of it had laid an ambush for the Roman cavalry, and driven them and Lollius their leader backward in confusion and disgrace. But that storm had rolled away again, and the tribes sent hostages and begged for peace. Roman influence seemed spreading through the north, as year by year the legions and the traders carried the arts of settled life into the heart of Germany. But in an evil hour Quintilius Varus was sent thither in command. The rule seemed too lax, and the change too slow for his impatience, and he set himself to consolidate and civilize in hot haste. Discontent and disaffection spread apace, but Varus saw no danger and had no suspicions. The German chieftains, when their plots were laid, plied him with fair assurances of peace, lured him to leave the Rhine and march toward the Visurgis (Weser), through tribes that were all ready for revolt. Wiser heads warned him of the coming danger, but in vain. He took no heed. He would not even keep his troops together and in hand. At last the schemers, Arminius, Hermann at their head, thought the time had come. They began the rising at a distance and made him think it only a local outbreak in a friendly country. So they led him on through forest lands, then rose upon him on all sides in a dangerous defile. The legions, taken by surprise as they were marching carelessly, hampered with baggage and camp followers, could make little head against their foes. They tried to struggle on through swamps and woods, where falling trees crushed them as they passed along, and barricades were piled by unseen hands, while wind and rain seemed leagued together for their ruin. 3 days they stood at bay and strove to beat off their assailants, who returned with fresh fury to the charge. Then their strength or courage failed them. The more resolute spirits slew themselves with their own hands, and the rest sank down to die. 9 A.D. Of 3 full legions few survived, and for many a year the name of that field of death, the Saltus Teutoburgiensis, sounded ominously in Roman ears. In the capital there was a panic for a while. A short time before they had heard the tidings that Pannonia was in revolt, and now came the news that Germany was all in arms, and forcing the Roman lines, stripped as they were of their army of defence, might pour into Italy, which seemed a possible, nay, easy prey. The danger indeed was not so imminent. Tiberius, and after him Germanicus, maintained the frontier and avenged their soldiers. But the loss of prestige was very great, and the emperor felt it till his death. For months of mourning he would not trim his beard or cut his hair, and "Varus, give me back my legions," was the moan men often heard him utter. He felt it the more keenly because soldiers were so hard to find. At the centre no one would enlist. In vain he appealed to their sense of honour. In vain he had recourse to stringent penalties. He was forced at last to enrol freedmen and make up his legions from the rabble of the streets. He had seen long since with alarm that the population was decreasing, had restocked the dwindling country towns with colonists, had tried to promote marriage among all classes, had forced through a reluctant Senate the Lex Papia Poppaea, by which celibacy was saddled with penal disabilities. But men noticed with a sneer that the 2 consuls after whom the law was named were both unmarried, and it was a hopeless effort to arrest such social tendencies by legislation. The central countries of the empire could not now find men to fill the ranks. The veterans might be induced to forsake the little glebes of which they soon grew weary, but others would not answer to the call. Whole regions were almost deserted, and the scanty populations had little mind for war. So the distant provinces became the legions' recruiting ground, and the last comers in the empire must defend it. Under the pressure of such public and domestic cares, we need not wonder that the emperor became moody and morose, and that the unlovely qualities of earlier days began to reappear. He shunned the gentle courtesies of social life, would be present at no festive gathering, disliked even to be noticed or saluted. Increasing weakness gave him an excuse for failing to be present in the Senate. A few picked men could represent the body, and the emperor's bedchamber became a privy council. He heard with petulance that the exiles in the islands were trying to relax the rigour of their lot, and living in comfort and in luxury. Stringent restrictions were imposed upon their freedom. He heard of writings that were passed through men's hands in which his name was spoken of with caustic wit and scant respect. The books must be hunted out at once and burnt, and the authors punished if they could be found. The bitter partisanship with which Titus Labienus had expressed his republican sympathies, and the meaning look with which he turned over pages of his history, which could be read only after he was dead, have made his name almost typical of the struggle between despotism and literary independence. Cassius Severus said he must be burnt himself if the memory of Labienus's work must be quite stamped out, and his was accordingly the first of the long list of cases in which the old laws of treason, the leges majestatis, were strained to reach not acts alone, but words. A much more familiar name, the poet Ovid, is brought before us at this time. The spoiled child of the fashionable society of Rome, he had early lent his facile wit to amuse the careless worldlings round him, had made a jest of the remonstrances of serious friends who tried to win his thoughts to politics and busy life, and had squandered all his high gifts of poetry on frivolous or wanton themes. His conversational powers or his literary fame attracted the notice of the younger Julia, and he was drawn into the gay circle that surrounded her. There, in an evil hour, it seems, he was made the confidant of dangerous secrets, and was one of the earliest to suffer when the emperor's eyes at last were opened. To the would-be censor and reformer of the public morals, who had turned his back upon the follies of his youth, the poet's writings must have long been distasteful as thinly veiled allurements to licentiousness. The indignant grandfather eyed them still more sternly, saw in them the source or the apology of wanton deeds, and drove their author from the Rome he loved so well in 8 A.D. to a half-civilized home at Tomi on the Scythian frontier, from which all his unmanly flatteries and lamentations failed to free him. It was time Augustus should be called away. He had lived too long for happiness and fame. His subjects were growing weary of their master, and some were ready to conspire against him. Still, doubtless, in the provinces, men blessed his name, as they thought of the prosperity and peace which he had long secured to them. One ship's crew of Alexandria, we read, when he put into Puteoli, where they were, came with garlands, frankincense, and glad words of praise to do him honour. To him they owed, so ran their homage, their lives, their liberties, and the well-being of their trade. But those who knew him best were colder in their praises now, and scarcely wished that he should tarry long among them. For 75 years his strength held out, sickly and enfeebled as his body seemed. The summons came as he was coasting by Campania, and left him only time to crawl to Naples and thence to Nola, where he died. To those who stood beside his bed, his last words, if reported truly, breathed the spirit of his life. "What think ye of the comedy, my friends? Have I fairly played my part in it? If so, applaud." The applause, if any, must be given to the actor rather than to the man, for the least lovely features of his character seemed most truly his. In his last years he was busy with the task of giving an account of his long stewardship. Long ago he had set on foot a survey of the empire, and maps had been prepared by the geographical studies of Agrippa. Valuations of landed property had been made as one step, though a very partial one, toward a uniform system of taxation. He had now gathered up for the benefit of his successors and the Senate all the varied information that lay ready to his hand. He had written out with his own hand, we are told, the statistics of chief moment, an account of the population in its various grades of privilege, the muster rolls of all the armies and fleets, and the balance sheet of the revenue and expenditure of state. Taught by the experience of later years, or from the depression caused by decaying strength, he added for future rulers the advice to be content with organizing what was won already, and not to push the frontiers of the army further. Before he died, he took a last survey of his own life, wrote out a summary of all the public acts which he cared to recall to memory, and left directions that the chronicle should be engraved on brazen tablets in the mausoleum built to do him honour. The chronicle may still be read, though not at Rome. In a distant province, at the town of Ancyra in Galatia, a temple had been built for the worship of Augustus, and the guardian priests had a copy of his own biography carved out at length in stone on one of the side walls. The temple has passed since then to other uses, and witnessed the rites of a different religion. Houses have sprung up round it, and partly hidden, though probably preserve the old inscription. Until of late, only a part of it could be deciphered, but a few years ago the patient energy of the explorers sent out by the French government succeeded in uncovering the whole wall, and making a complete copy of nearly all that had been written on it. From the place where it was found, its literary name is the Monumentum Ancyranum. It is not without a certain grandeur, which even those may feel who dispute the author's claim to greatness. With stately confidence and monumental brevity of detail, it unfolds the long roll of his successes. Disdaining seemingly to stoop to the pettiness of bitter words, it speaks calmly of his fallen rivals, veiling indeed in constitutional terms the illegalities of his career, but misleading or unfair only by its silence. Not a word is there to revive the hateful memory of the proscriptions, little to indicate the dire suspense of the war with Sextus Pompeius, or the straits and anxieties of the long struggle with Antonius. But those questionable times of his career once past, the narrative flows calmly on. It recounts with proud self-confidence the long list of battles fought and victories won, the nations finally subdued under his rule, the Eastern potentates who sought his friendship, the vassal princes who courted his protection. It tells of the many colonies which he had founded, and of the towns recruited by his veterans, speaks of the vast sums that he had spent on shows and largesse for the people, and describes the aqueducts and various buildings that had sprung up at his bidding to add to the material magnificence of Rome. For all these benefits the grateful citizens had hailed him as the father of his country. To the provincials who read these lines it might seem perhaps that there were few signs in them of any feeling that the empire owed any duties to themselves. A few words of reference to the sums spent in time of need upon their towns, and that was all. To the administrator it might seem a strange omission to say nothing of the great change in the ruling mechanism. Yet in what was there omitted lay his claim to greatness. The plea which justified the empire was found in the newly organized machinery of government and in the peace and justice long secured to the whole civilized world. High as he had risen in life, he was to be raised to a yet higher rank after his death, and the deified Augustus became, like many a succeeding emperor, the object of a national worship. A phenomenon so startling to our modern thought calls for some words of comment. First, we may note that polytheism naturally tends to efface the boundary lines between the human and the divine. It peoples earth and air and water with its phantom beings of bounded powers and clashing wills, and weaves with wanton hand the fanciful tissue of its legends, in which it plays with the story of their loves and hates and fitful moods of passion, till its deities can scarcely be distinguished from the mortal men and women in whose likeness they are pictured. Eastern thought, moreover, seldom scrupled to honour its great men with the names and qualities of godhead. Often in servile flattery, sometimes perhaps in the spirit of a mystic creed, it saw in the rulers who it feared a sort of avatar or incarnation of a power divine, which it made the object of its worship. The pharaohs of Egypt and the monarchs of Assyria were deified even in their lifetime by the language of inscriptions, and in later times temples were raised in Asia Minor in honour of the governors of the day, so that Antonius and Cleopatra gave little shock to Eastern sentiment when in their royal pageant they assumed the titles and symbols of Isis and Osiris. It was therefore on this side of the Roman world that the fashion of worshipping the emperor began. Even in the lifetime of Augustus, deputations came from the towns of Asia, which were anxious to set up altars and build temples in his honour. For a while, indeed, he treated them with coldness and sometimes with mockery. He yet could not quite repress the enthusiasm of their servile worship, which grew apace in the more distant provinces. Less credulous minds looked upon the tendency as only a fanciful way of symbolizing a great fact. Much of the simple faith in the old legendary creeds had passed away before the critical spirit of Greek culture, and many thought that the heroes and gods of the old fables were but the great men of past times seen through the mist of popular fancy, till a divine halo gathered round their superhuman stature. If the sentiment of bygone days had made gods out of the men who sowed the seeds of art and learning, and tamed the savagery of early life, the wondering awe of ignorant folk might be allowed to crystallize still in the same forms, and to find a national deity in the great ruler who secured for the whole world the boon of civilized order. So reasoned probably the critical and unimpassioned, content to humour the credulous fancy of the masses, and to deal tenderly with an admiration which they did not share, but which it might be dangerous to thwart. Above all, in Italy, the tendency in question found support and strength in a widespread feeling which had lingered on from early times, that the souls of men did not pass away at death, but still haunted their old homes, and watched as guardian lares over the weal and woe of the generations that came after. Offering and prayer seemed but a fitting token of respect, and might be useful to quicken their sympathies or appease their envy. Thus every natural unity, the family, the clan, the canton, and the nation, had their tutelary powers and special ritual of genuine home growth, while in nearly all besides the foreign influences had overlaid the old religious forms. It had been part of the conservative policy of Augustus to foster these old forms of worship, to repair the little chapels in the city wards, and to give priestly functions to the masters of the streets officially connected with them. Even while he lived, he allowed the figure of his Genius to be placed in the chapels beside the Lares. At his death, divine honours were assigned to it as to the rest, or rather it rose above them all, as the imperial unity had towered above the petty districts which they were thought to guard. Temples rose to the deified Augustus, altars smoked in every land, and guilds of Augustales were organized to do him priestly service, for the provinces were eager to follow the example of the imperial city, and their loyal zeal had even outstripped the reverence of Rome. The ruling powers were well pleased to see a halo of awfulness gather round their race, while subject peoples saw in the apotheosis of the monarch only a fitting climax to the majesty of his life and a symbol of the greatness of the empire. And so succeeding monarchs in their turn were deified by pagan Rome, as saints were canonized by favour of the Pope. The Senate's vote gave divine honours with the title of Deus, and it was passed commonly as a matter of course, or withheld only as a token of abhorrence or contempt. End of section 4.